Chapter 1, A Routine Disrupted. Paige Ward's alarm clock chirped at precisely 6:30 a.m., as it did every weekday morning. She silenced it with a well-practiced tap, her hand finding the off switch without need for visual guidance. Paige didn't believe in the snooze button. In her world, everything had its place and time, including the start of her day. With the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, she went through her morning routine. Shower, 7 minutes. Hair and makeup, 12 minutes. Choosing an outfit, 5 minutes, thanks to her meticulously organized closet where every item was color-coded and categorized by season. By 7:15, she was out the door of her cozy apartment, ready to face another predictable day in the quaint town of Stardust. Paige paused on the front step, inhaling deeply. The crisp morning air nipped at her cheeks, carrying the sweet scent of blooming lilacs that lined her street. She adjusted the strap of her sensible leather satchel and set off down the cobblestone path, her steps quick and purposeful. The town was just beginning to stir. Mr. Finch was opening his antique shop, the window display featuring a gramophone that Paige could have sworn winked at her. She shook her head, dismissing the fanciful thought. Mrs. Henderson was walking her corgi, Mr. Pickles, who barked a cheerful greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Paige called out with a wave. "Hello, Mr. Pickles. Lovely day, isn't it, dear?" Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes twinkling. "Perfect for a bit of magic, I'd say." Paige chuckled politely, attributing the odd comment to the old woman's eccentricity. "If you say so, Mrs. Henderson. Have a wonderful day." As she continued her walk, Paige couldn't help but notice the way the morning light seemed to dance across the quaint storefronts, casting an almost ethereal glow. Had Stardust always looked this magical? She shook her head, chalking it up to her imagination running wild. Her first stop, as always, was Beanstalk Bistro. The bell above the door jingled merrily as she entered, greeted by the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and warm pastries. Abigail Bellamy, the eccentric owner, looked up from behind the counter, her silver hair adorned with what appeared to be tiny origami birds today. "Good morning, Paige." "The usual?" Abigail called out, her eyes twinkling behind her round, purple-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, Abigail." "Yes, please," Paige replied with a smile. She could set her watch by this exchange. As Abigail prepared her drink, Paige's gaze wandered around the cafe. The walls were covered in an ever-changing array of local artwork, each piece more whimsical than the last. Today, a painting of a teacup riding a bicycle caught her eye, making her chuckle softly. Was it just her imagination, or did the painted teacup seem to wobble slightly as if actually pedaling? "Here you go, dear. One medium vanilla latte with an extra shot and a sprinkle of cinnamon," Abigail announced, sliding the cup across the counter. "Oh, and take a look at this. We're hosting an art show next week." Paige accepted the flyer Abigail thrust into her hand, her eyebrows rising as she took in the riot of colors splashed across the paper. The headline screamed in a font that seemed to shimmer, "Experience the peculiar art of Elliot Rhodes." "Peculiar is certainly one word for it," Paige murmured, her eyes drawn to what appeared to be a painting of a book sprouting wings. The image seemed to flutter on the page, as if the book might take flight at any moment. She blinked hard, sure she must be more tired than she thought. "Thanks, Abigail. I'll think about it." With a wave, Paige exited the cafe, her routine momentarily disrupted as she found herself still staring at the flyer while walking. She nearly collided with a lamppost, catching herself just in time. "Get it together, Ward," she muttered, shaking her head and stuffing the flyer into her bag. But try as she might, she couldn't quite shake the image of those flying books from her mind. The rest of her walk to the Stardust Library was uneventful, save for the usual greetings exchanged with familiar faces along the way. At precisely 8 a.m., Paige unlocked the library doors, breathing in the comforting scent of books and polished wood. She moved through her opening tasks with practiced ease, turning on computers, straightening already straight shelves, and preparing for the day's events. As she arranged the children's reading circle, Paige found herself humming softly, an unusual occurrence for her typically silent mornings. The tune was unfamiliar, yet it felt right somehow, as if the library itself was singing through her. It wasn't until she was setting up for the morning's story time that the first real hiccup in her routine occurred. A delivery man appeared, pushing a dolly stacked high with boxes. "Mornin'," he grunted, thrusting a clipboard at her. "Sign here." Paige frowned, accepting the pen. "I'm sorry, but we weren't expecting any deliveries today." The man shrugged. "Don't shoot the messenger, lady. Just doing my job." With a sigh, Paige signed and helped direct the boxes to a corner of the children's section. As soon as the delivery man left, she pried open the top box, curiosity getting the better of her. Marvin the mischievous mandrake? Wendy's first wand? Paige read aloud, pulling out book after book. These are all magical themed? She couldn't help but laugh at the coincidence. First the art show flyer, now this. It seemed the universe was trying to inject a little magic into her orderly life. As she leafed through Wendy's first wand, a spark seemed to dance across the pages, leaving a trail of glitter in its wake. Paige blinked, sure she must be seeing things. Before she could ponder it further, the pitter-patter of little feet announced the arrival of her first story time group. Paige quickly shoved the magical books back into their box and plastered on her best librarian smile. "Good morning, everyone. Who's ready for a story?" A chorus of excited voices greeted her as the children settled onto the colorful rug. Paige reached for her planned book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, but her hand seemed to have a mind of its own. Instead, she found herself pulling out Marvin the Mischievous Mandrake from the newly delivered box. "Well," she said, more to herself than the children, "I suppose we could try something new today." As she began to read, something extraordinary happened. The illustrations seemed to come alive, with Marvin the Mandrake wiggling his leafy arms and winking at the children. The kids were enthralled, giggling and pointing at the seemingly animated pages. Paige, for her part, tried to maintain her composure, chalking it up to an overactive imagination fueled by lack of sleep. The rest of the day passed in a blur of issues, book recommendations, and the satisfying thunk of the date stamp. Yet, Paige couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Books seemed to leap into patrons' hands as if choosing them, and she could have sworn she heard whispering coming from the reference section when no one was there. By closing time, Paige's head was spinning with the day's unusual occurrences. As she was locking up, her phone buzzed with a text from Maggie, "Drinks at Beanstalk? I'm dying for one of Abigail's cosmic cocktails." Paige hesitated for a moment. It wasn't part of her usual routine, but she thought of the art show flyer, still tucked away in her bag, and all the odd happenings of the day. Maybe it was time to shake things up a bit. "Sure," she texted back. "Meet you there in 15. The evening air was warm and inviting as Paige made her way back to Beanstalk Bistro. The street lamps cast a soft glow, and she could have sworn she saw shadows dancing in the periphery of her vision. Stardust seemed different somehow, as if it had been waiting all day to reveal its true nature under the cover of twilight. Maggie was already perched at the bar when Paige arrived, her wild red curls bobbing as she chatted animatedly with Abigail. She waved Paige over enthusiastically. "There you are," Maggie exclaimed, pulling Paige into a quick hug. "I was just telling Abigail about my latest classroom disaster. Who knew that mixing glitter and sneezing kids was a bad idea?" Paige laughed, sliding onto the stool next to her friend. "I could have told you that. It's why we banned glitter from the library craft sessions." "Boring," Maggie declared with a grin. "Where's the fun in that?" "Oh, Abigail, can we get 2 Starlight surprises, please?" As Abigail bustled off to mix their drinks, Maggie turned to Paige with a mischievous glint in her eye. "So, any excitement in the world of Dewey Decimals today?" Paige hesitated for a moment before pulling out the now crumpled. As she made her way home, Paige couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted. Her carefully ordered world suddenly seemed full of possibilities, of magic waiting to be discovered. She couldn't have imagined then how this simple decision to attend an art show would upend her carefully ordered existence, or how a certain chaotic artist was about to burst into her life like a whirlwind of color and magic. Paige fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, dreaming of books that flew and paintings that danced. Chapter 2, A Splash of Color. The week leading up to the art show passed in a blur for Paige. Each day seemed to bring new curiosities that tested her rational mind. Books in the library whispered when she walked by, their pages rustling without a breeze. Her morning lattes at Beanstalk Bistro featured foam art that winked at her. Even her normally predictable walk to work became an adventure, with flowers along the path seeming to turn their heads to follow her progress. By the time Friday evening rolled around, Paige found herself standing before her closet, uncharacteristically flustered about what to wear. She finally settled on a floral dress that she'd impulse bought months ago but never had the courage to wear. Its vibrant colors seemed fitting for an art show, promising the peculiar. "It's just an art show," Paige muttered to herself as she applied a touch of lipstick. "Nothing to be nervous about." Yet, as she made her way to Beanstalk Bistro, her heart fluttered with an excitement she couldn't quite explain. The usually quiet streets of Stardust hummed with energy. Or was that just her imagination? Maggie was waiting outside the bistro, her red curls even wilder than usual. "Paige. You look amazing," she exclaimed, pulling her friend into a hug. "Ready for some magic?" Paige laughed, shaking her head. "It's art, Maggie, not magic." "Oh, honey," Maggie said with a knowing smirk, "you have no idea." As they stepped into the bistro, Paige's senses were immediately overwhelmed. The air shimmered with an otherworldly quality, filled with the buzz of excited conversations and the faint scent of ozone. The walls, usually adorned with local artwork, now showcased the most extraordinary paintings Paige had ever seen. A landscape of rolling hills seemed to breathe, the grass swaying in a non-existent breeze. A portrait of a young girl giggled silently, her eyes following the patrons as they moved about the room. And there, in the center of it all, was a painting of a book. As Paige watched, its pages turned slowly, revealing glimpses of fantastical worlds within. "Is this real?" Paige whispered, more to herself than to Maggie. Her friend grinned. "Welcome to the world of Elliot Rhodes, where nothing is quite what it seems." They moved deeper into the bistro, which had been transformed into a labyrinth of canvases. Each turn brought new wonders, a city skyline where the buildings rearranged themselves like a shifting puzzle, a bowl of fruit where apples transformed into oranges and back again, a starry night sky where constellations danced and reformed. Paige found herself laughing in delight, her usual reserved demeanor forgotten in the face of such whimsy. She reached out to touch a painting of a butterfly, gasping as it fluttered its wings in response. "Careful," a warm voice chuckled behind her. "That one's a bit ticklish." Paige spun around, coming face to face with the most captivating pair of blue eyes she'd ever seen. The man before her was tall and lean, with tousled black hair that looked as if he'd just run his paint-stained fingers through it. His smile was lopsided and infectious, and Paige found herself smiling back before she even realized it. "You must be Elliot Rhodes," Paige said, extending her hand. "I'm Paige Ward." As their hands met, a spark of electricity seemed to jump between them, making them both start. For a moment, they stood frozen, hands clasped, eyes locked. Elliot recovered first, his smile widening. "Paige," he repeated, as if savoring the sound. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Are you enjoying the show?" "It's incredible," Paige admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." "How do you do it?" Elliot's eyes twinkled mischievously. "A magician never reveals his secrets," he teased. Then, leaning in conspiratorially, he whispered, "But between you and me, it's all in the brushstrokes." Paige laughed, charmed despite herself. Well, your brushstrokes are certainly magical, Mr. Rhodes. Please, call me Elliot, he insisted. Would you like a tour of the exhibit? I could give you the inside scoop on some of the pieces. Before Paige could respond, Maggie appeared at her elbow, grinning like a Cheshire cat. She'd love to, Maggie said, giving Paige a not-so-subtle push towards Elliot. I'll just go find us some of Abigail's famous cocktails. Have fun. And with that, Paige found herself alone with the enigmatic artist, surrounded by paintings that defied reason. As Elliot began to lead her through the exhibit, explaining his inspirations and techniques, Paige couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world where anything was possible. They moved from painting to painting, Elliot's enthusiasm infectious. He spoke of colors as if they were old friends, of canvases as portals to other worlds. Paige found herself hanging on his every word, her analytical mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be possible. And this one, Elliot said, stopping before a large canvas, is my personal favorite. The painting depicted a library, but unlike any library Paige had ever seen. Books flew from shelf to shelf of their own accord, their pages fluttering like wings. Staircases shifted and moved, leading to hidden alcoves that appeared and disappeared. And in the center of it all, a librarian stood, her face serene amidst the literary chaos. It's beautiful, Paige breathed, leaning in for a closer look. It reminds me of my library, but more alive. Elliot beamed. That's exactly what I was going for. A place where knowledge isn't just stored, but active and engaging. Where every book is an adventure waiting to happen. As Paige watched, she could have sworn she saw the librarian in the painting turn and wink at her. She blinked hard, sure she must be imagining things. You know, Elliot said softly, I've always believed that the best art speaks to something inside us. Something we might not even know is there until we see it reflected back at us. Paige turned to look at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, the bustling art show faded away, and it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. The spell was broken by a loud crash. They both jumped, turning to see that Elliot had accidentally backed into a small table holding paint supplies. A can of vibrant blue paint teetered on the edge before tipping over, its contents splashing across the floor and all over Paige's dress. Oh no! Elliot exclaimed, his face a picture of horror. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Here, let me. In his haste to help, he stepped in the puddle of paint, slipped, and went down hard, taking Paige with him. They landed in a heap, both now thoroughly covered in blue paint. For a moment there was silence. Then Paige began to laugh. It started as a giggle, then grew into a full-bodied laugh that shook her entire frame. After a second of stunned silence, Elliot joined in, his rich laughter blending with hers. Well, Paige managed between giggles, I guess I'm now a living piece of art. Elliot grinned, reaching out to smear a bit more paint on her cheek. And a masterpiece at that, he said, his eyes twinkling. They helped each other up, still chuckling. The other patrons had gathered around, some looking concerned, others amused. Maggie pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes wide. Paige. Are you okay? She asked, then paused, taking in the scene. A slow grin spread across her face. Well. Looks like you two are really hitting it off. Paige felt her cheeks heat up, suddenly very aware of Elliot's hand still on her arm. It was an accident, she mumbled. A happy accident, Elliot added, winking at her. Though I do feel terrible about your dress. Please, let me make it up to you. Coffee, perhaps? Once we've both had a chance to clean up, of course. Paige hesitated for a moment. This wasn't like her at all, she didn't go on spontaneous coffee dates with men she'd just met, especially not after being doused in paint. But there was something about Elliot that made her want to step out of her comfort zone. All right, she found herself saying. Coffee sounds lovely. Elliot's face lit up with a smile that could have outshone the sun. Wonderful. How about tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock, back here at the bistro? Paige nodded, feeling a flutter of excitement in her stomach. It's a date. As they said their goodbyes and Paige left with Maggie, she couldn't stop smiling. Her dress was ruined, she was covered in paint, and yet she felt lighter than she had in years. So, Maggie said as they walked home, a knowing smile on her face. Still think it's just art and not magic? Paige thought about the paintings that Chapter 3, Brewing Magic. The morning sun peeked through Paige's curtains, rousing her from dreams filled with swirling colors and laughing blue eyes. For a moment, she lay still, wondering if the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid imagination. But the faint blue stains on her fingers told a different story. Paige found herself humming as she got ready, a spring in her step that had been absent for far too long. She chose a sundress in a soft yellow, perfect for a casual coffee date. As she pinned up her chestnut waves, she couldn't help but wonder what surprises the day might bring. The walk to Beanstalk Bistro seemed charged with possibility. The flowers along the path seemed more vibrant, their scent more intoxicating. A group of sparrows burst into song as she passed, their melody sounding almost like a cheerful "A good morning, Paige." She arrived at the bistro a few minutes early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The bell above the door chimed merrily as she entered, and she was immediately enveloped in the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and pastries. Abigail greeted her with a knowing smile. "Good morning, dear. Your young man isn't here yet, but why don't you take a seat? I'll bring you your usual to start." Paige felt her cheeks warm at the phrase "your young man," but she didn't correct Abigail. Instead, she chose a cozy table by the window, bathed in warm sunlight. As she waited, she found her gaze drawn to the walls, where a few of Elliot's paintings still hung. A landscape of a winding river seemed to ripple and flow, the water so realistic she could almost hear it babbling. She was so engrossed in the painting that she didn't notice Elliot's arrival until he spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" His voice was warm and rich, like honey in sunlight. Paige turned, a smile already forming on her lips. Elliot stood before her, looking slightly disheveled but utterly charming. His black hair was tousled as if he'd run his fingers through it repeatedly, and there was a smudge of what looked like green paint on his cheek. "Good morning," Paige said, gesturing for him to sit. "I was just admiring your work. It's even more incredible in the daylight." Elliot's eyes crinkled as he smiled, sliding into the seat across from her. "Thank you. I'm glad you like it. Though I must say, the view from here is even more breathtaking." His gaze was fixed firmly on Paige as he said this, causing a blush to creep up her neck. Before she could formulate a response, Abigail appeared with 2 steaming mugs. "Here we are," she said cheerfully. "One vanilla latte for Paige, and a double espresso for Elliot. Enjoy, dears." As Abigail retreated, Elliot leaned forward conspiratorially. "Watch this," he whispered, his eyes twinkling with mischief. He waved his hand over Paige's latte, muttering something under his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the foam on top of the latte began to move. It swirled and twisted, forming intricate patterns that seemed to dance across the surface of the coffee. Paige watched, mesmerized, as flowers bloomed and faded, replaced by swooping birds and leaping dolphins. "That's incredible," she breathed, leaning in for a closer look. "How did you dash?" Her question was cut short as the foam suddenly began to spin faster, forming a miniature whirlpool in the center of the mug. Coffee sloshed over the sides, narrowly missing Paige's dress as she jerked back in surprise. "Oh no," Elliot muttered, waving his hand frantically. "No, no, no. Stop that." The whirlpool only grew stronger, coffee now spraying in all directions. Paige couldn't help it, she burst into laughter, the look of panicked concentration on Elliot's face too comical to resist. I'm so sorry, Elliot said, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. That wasn't supposed to happen. Here, let me just dash. With a final, desperate wave of his hand, the coffee suddenly froze midair, droplets suspended as if by invisible strings. Then, as if someone had hit rewind, every drop flew back into the mug, leaving the table and surrounding area spotless. Paige sat in stunned silence for a moment, her eyes darting between the now innocent-looking latte and Elliot's sheepish face. Then, she started to laugh again, the absurdity of the situation overwhelming her. Well, she said once she'd caught her breath, I can honestly say that's the most exciting coffee date I've ever been on. Elliot's face broke into a relieved grin. I'm glad you're not upset. I was trying to impress you, but I suppose I got a bit carried away. Consider me impressed, Paige said, raising her mug in a toast. Though perhaps we should stick to more conventional conversation topics for now? Elliot nodded, clinking his mug against hers. Agreed. So, Paige, tell me about yourself. What's life like for a librarian in Stardust? As they sipped their coffee, which thankfully remained well-behaved for the rest of the morning, Paige found herself opening up more than she had in years. She told Elliot about her love for books, the joy she found in helping children discover the magic of reading, and the comfort she took in the orderly world of the library. But lately, she admitted, I've been feeling like there's something missing. Like there's more to the world than what I can categorize and shelve. Elliot nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. I know exactly what you mean. That's why I paint, you know. To capture those moments of magic that exist just beyond our everyday perception. As Elliot began to talk about his art, Paige found herself captivated. He spoke of colors as if they were living things, of canvases as portals to other worlds. His hands moved animatedly as he described his creative process, occasionally causing nearby salt shakers to rattle or napkins to flutter. Sorry about that, he said after a particularly enthusiastic gesture sent a sugar packet spinning across the table. I tend to get a bit energetic when I'm excited. Paige laughed, catching the sugar packet before it could fall. I like it, she said. Your enthusiasm is contagious. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, meandering from topic to topic. Paige shared funny stories about eccentric library patrons, while Elliot regaled her with tales of his travels and the inspiration behind some of his paintings. As Elliot described a particularly vivid sunset he'd witnessed in Greece, Paige noticed something odd. The painting of the river behind him seemed to be changing, the water taking on the fiery hues of the sunset Elliot was describing. Elliot, she said, pointing behind him. Is that supposed to be happening? Elliot turned, his eyes widening as he took in the transforming painting. He said, running a hand through his hair. Sometimes my emotions can influence things around me. Especially my own artwork. He waved his hand, and the painting settled back into its original blue hues. But Paige had seen enough to know that there was far more to Elliot Rhodes than met the eye. Elliot, she said slowly, are you magical? For a moment, Elliot looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then, his shoulders sagged slightly. I suppose there's no point in denying it now, is there? He said with a rueful smile. Yes, Paige. I'm a wizard. Paige sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. A wizard. Of course. It explained so much, the moving paintings, the coffee whirlpool, the subtle oddities she'd been noticing around town ever since she'd seen that first flyer. I understand if this is too much, Elliot said quickly, misinterpreting her silence. I know it's a lot to take in. If you want to leave, I dash. No. Paige surprised herself with the vehemence of her response. No, I don't want to leave. I have so many questions. Relief washed over Elliot's face, followed quickly by a boyish grin. Well then, ask away. I'm an open book, a magical one, of course, but open nonetheless. For the next hour, Paige peppered Elliot with questions. How long had he been a wizard? Were there others like him? Could he do anything he wanted with magic? Elliot answered each query patiently, occasionally demonstrating with small, subtle spells that wouldn't draw attention from the other patrons. The most important thing to remember, Elliot said as he made a sugar cube dance across the table, is that magic isn't about power or control. It's about connection, to the world around us, to other people, to the very essence of life itself. Paige nodded, watching the sugar cube pirouette. I think I understand. It's like, with a laugh, she entered her apartment, already looking forward to whatever magical adventure might come next. The ordinary world she had known was transforming before her eyes, and Paige Ward, ever the avid reader, couldn't wait to see how this story would unfold. Chapter 4, Once Upon a Magical Time. The week following their coffee date passed in a blur of stolen glances and shy smiles for Paige. Each morning, she'd find a whimsical surprise waiting for her at the library. One day, a origami butterfly that actually fluttered its paper wings. The next, a bookmark that changed its inspirational quote every time she looked at it. Elliot's magical tokens of affection never failed to bring a smile to her face, even as they left her slightly flustered. By Friday, Paige had gathered her courage. As she shelved books, an idea began to form. Why not invite Elliot to the library's weekly story time? It would be a perfect opportunity to share her world with him, just as he'd shared his magical realm with her. With slightly trembling fingers, she typed out a text, "Story time at the library tomorrow at 10 a.m. Want to be my special guest reader?" The response came almost immediately, "I'd be honored." Should I bring anything? Perhaps a magic wand? Paige chuckled, shaking her head fondly. Just bring yourself. And maybe leave the more obvious magic at home? We don't want to scare the children. No promises, came Elliot's reply, accompanied by a string of sparkle emojis. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Paige arrived at the library early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. She busied herself setting up the children's area, arranging cushions in a circle and selecting a stack of picture books for the day's session. As the clock struck 10, families began to filter in. The children, ranging from toddlers to early readers, settled onto the cushions with varying degrees of wiggles and giggles. Parents took up positions around the edges of the room, some with younger siblings in tow. Paige checked her watch, a small frown creasing her brow. Where was Elliot? She was just about to start without him when the library doors burst open with a gust of wind that ruffled pages and sent a few loose papers swirling through the air. Elliot stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath, his hair more disheveled than usual. He was clutching a large, leather-bound book to his chest. Sorry I'm late, he panted, making his way to the front of the room. Had a bit of trouble with my transportation. Paige raised an eyebrow, but decided not to ask. Instead, she turned to the gathered children with a bright smile. Boys and girls, we have a special guest today. This is Mr. Elliot, and he's going to read us a very special story. The children chorused a greeting, their eyes wide with curiosity as they took in Elliot's eccentric appearance. He'd foregone his usual paint-splattered attire for a patchwork jacket that seemed to shimmer with hidden colors. Elliot settled into the reading chair, his long legs folded comically as he tried to fit into the child-sized seat. He opened the book with a flourish, and Paige caught a glimpse of swirling, iridescent text on the pages. Once upon a time, Elliot began, his voice taking on a mesmerizing quality, in a land not so different from our own. As he read, something extraordinary began to happen. Tiny motes of light drifted up from the pages, coalescing into shimmering images that hovered in the air. The children gasped in delight as a miniature castle formed, complete with tiny flags fluttering from its towers. Paige watched, torn between amazement and alarm. This was more magic than she'd bargained for, but the children seemed enthralled. Even the parents were leaning forward, their faces alight with wonder. Elliot continued his tale, spinning a yarn about a brave knight on a quest to save a kingdom from eternal winter. With each turn of the page, new images appeared, a galloping horse, a fearsome dragon, a forest of ice-covered trees. It was when Elliot reached the climax of the story that things began to go awry. As he described the knight's confrontation with the evil sorcerer, the book in his hands began to tremble. Elliot, Paige whispered urgently, is that supposed to happen? Before Elliot could respond, a voice emanated from the book itself. Oh, come on. Why do I always have to be the bad guy? The children shrieked with laughter as the sorcerer character, now a miniature floating figure, crossed his arms and pouted. Just once, I'd like to be the hero. Is that too much to ask? Elliot's eyes widened in panic, but he recovered quickly. Well, he said, addressing the sorcerer, why don't you tell us your side of the story? What followed was a chaotic, hilarious, and utterly magical storytelling session. The knight and the sorcerer bickered good-naturedly about who was really responsible for the eternal winter. The dragon insisted she was just misunderstood and really wanted to open a bakery. Even the horse chimed in, complaining about the knight's heavy armor. The children were beside themselves with glee, shouting out suggestions and questions to the characters. Parents who had started the session looking skeptical were now laughing along, their faces alight with childlike wonder. Paige watched it all unfold, her initial mortification giving way to amusement and then to genuine admiration. Elliot had taken what could have been a disaster and turned it into something truly special. He fielded the children's questions with ease, gently guiding the story towards a resolution that left everyone, even the reformed sorcerer, happy. As Elliot closed the book, the shimmering images faded away, leaving behind a room full of grinning faces and a palpable sense of magic in the air. That was awesome, one little boy exclaimed, bouncing in his seat. Can Mr. Elliot come every week? A chorus of agreement rose from the other children, and Paige found herself nodding along. We'll see, she said, catching Elliot's eye with a smile. I think Mr. Elliot might be a very busy man. As the families began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the extraordinary story time, Paige approached Elliot. That was something else, she said, shaking her head in amazement. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, looking sheepish. I'm sorry if I went overboard. The book was supposed to just show illustrations, not, well. He gestured vaguely. Bring the characters to life and start an existential debate? Paige finished, laughing. It's okay. The kids loved it. I loved it. The last part slipped out before she could stop it, and Paige felt her cheeks warm. But the smile Elliot gave her in return was worth any embarrassment. I'm glad, he said softly. I wanted to show you that magic can enhance the things you love, not just create chaos. Paige nodded, understanding dawning. Is that why you came to Stardust? To find a balance between your magic and the ordinary world? Elliot's smile turned wistful. Partly. The magical realm can be overwhelming. All flash and no substance sometimes. I wanted to find a place where magic could coexist with the everyday, making both a little more extraordinary. As they talked, they began to tidy up the children's area. Paige couldn't help but notice how Elliot's magic seemed to seep into even this mundane task. Cushions floated back to their proper places, and books shelved themselves with a gentle wave of his hand. You know, Paige said, watching a picture book do a somersault before sliding into its spot, I used to think my life was perfectly organized. Everything in its place, every day planned out. But now? Elliot prompted gently. Paige smiled, meeting his eyes. Now I'm realizing that maybe there's room for a little magic in my routine. The look Elliot gave her was so full of warmth and hope that Paige felt her heart skip a beat. She was about to say something more when a commotion from the main part of the library caught their attention. They hurried out of the children's section to find a scene of cheerful chaos. Books were flying off the shelves, arranging themselves in elaborate patterns in the air. A flock of origami birds fluttered near the ceiling, and the card catalog was shooting cards into the air like confetti. Oh no! Elliot groaned, his face a picture of dismay. I think my magic got a bit excited. Paige should have been upset. This was her orderly domain, after all. But as she watched a copy of A War and Peace do a graceful pirouette in midair, she found herself laughing instead. Well, she said, rolling up her sleeves, I guess we'd better get this sorted out before Monday. I don't think my regular patrons are quite ready for self-organizing shelves. Together, they set about restoring order to the library. Elliot used his magic to coax the more reluctant books back to their shelves, while Paige directed traffic, her librarian's knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System coming in handy as never before. As they worked, they talked and laughed, swapping stories about their most unusual experiences. Paige's tales of eccentric patrons. It was only when the automatic lights flickered on, reminding them of the late hour, that they finally prepared to leave. As Elliot helped Paige into her coat, his touch lingering on her shoulders, she turned to him with a smile. So, she said, same time next week for story time? Elliot's answering grin was brighter than any magic. I wouldn't miss it for the world. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, hand in hand, Paige felt as if she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. One filled with laughter, love, and just the right amount of magic. The street lamps flickered to life as they walked, and Paige could have sworn she saw tiny faces peeking out from the flower beds, heard whispered giggles on the breeze. The ordinary world she had known was transforming before her eyes, revealing hidden wonders at every turn. And at the center of it all was Elliot, his hand warm in hers, his presence a constant reminder that life could be both grounded and magical, ordered and wonderfully chaotic. As they reached the crossroads where they would part ways, Elliot turned to her, his eyes twinkling in the lamplight. You know, he said, I came to Stardust looking for inspiration, for a way to blend my magic with the everyday world. I never expected to find someone who would inspire me more than any landscape or bustling city ever could. Paige felt her cheeks warm, but she met his gaze steadily. And I never expected that my orderly life would be turned upside down in the most wonderful way possible. I guess we both found something we didn't know we were looking for. Elliot nodded, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. As he did, a shower of tiny, twinkling stars fell around them, as if the night sky itself was celebrating their connection. Good night, Paige, Elliot said softly. Thank you for a truly magical day. Good night, Elliot, Paige replied, her voice equally soft. Thank you for showing me that there's magic in the everyday, if you just know where to look. As they parted ways, Paige couldn't help but look back, watching Elliot's retreating form. Just before he turned the corner, she saw him leap into the air, his feet leaving the ground for just a moment longer than should have been possible. Paige laughed, shaking her head fondly. Her life had certainly become more unpredictable since Elliot Rhodes had entered it. As she made her way home, surrounded by the soft glow of street lamps and the whispered secrets of a town she was seeing with new eyes, her mind was already racing with ideas. Tomorrow was Sunday, traditionally her day for quiet reading and catching up on chores. But now, with the memory of today's magical story time still fresh, she wondered if perhaps it was time to shake up her routine a bit more. Maybe she could surprise Elliot this time. But what could she, a non-magical librarian, offer that would impress a wizard? As she climbed the steps to her apartment, a plan began to form. It would take some research, perhaps a bit of help from Maggie, and a dash of courage, but Paige was determined. Chapter 5, A Dance with Nature. Sunday dawned bright and clear, filled with possibility. Paige woke early, her mind already buzzing with plans. She'd spent the previous evening researching local folklore and legends, determined to surprise Elliot with her own brand of magic, the kind found in stories and imagination. As she went about her usual Sunday routine of laundry and meal prep, Paige found herself humming, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. Even the most mundane tasks seemed infused with a sense of anticipation. Around midday, her phone buzzed with a text from Elliot, "Free this evening? I'd love to show you something special." Paige's heart skipped a beat as she replied, "Sounds intriguing. What should I wear? Something comfortable for walking. And maybe bring a jacket, it might get chilly later. As evening approached, Paige chose a flowing sundress in soft blue, pairing it with comfortable sandals and a light cardigan. She was just putting the finishing touches on her makeup when she heard a knock at her door. Elliot stood on her doorstep, looking dashing in a crisp white shirt and dark jeans. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, offering her a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you," Paige replied, blushing as she accepted the flowers. "These are lovely. Let me just put them in water before we go." As she turned to find a vase, she could have sworn she saw the flowers stretch and preen, as if enjoying the attention. She shook her head, smiling to herself. Life with Elliot was certainly making her see magic everywhere. "So, where are we going?" Paige asked as they set off down the twilight-lit streets of Stardust. Elliot's eyes twinkled mischievously. "It's a surprise. But I think you'll like it." They walked hand in hand through the town, chatting about their days. Paige told Elliot about her research into local legends, and he listened with genuine interest, occasionally adding tidbits of magical lore that made her wonder how much of the town's history was intertwined with the supernatural. As they neared the outskirts of town, Paige began to hear the faint sound of trickling water and smell the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers. Elliot led her down a winding path she'd never noticed before, overhung with weeping willows whose branches seemed to part for them as they passed. They emerged into a breathtaking garden, bathed in the soft glow of fairy lights strung through the trees. A small stream bubbled through the center, crossed by quaint wooden bridges. Flowers of every imaginable color bloomed everywhere, their perfume filling the air. "Elliot," Paige breathed, "this is incredible. I had no idea this was here." He smiled, squeezing her hand. "The enchanted garden of Stardust. It's a bit selective about who it reveals itself to. I thought it was time you saw it." As they wandered through the garden, Paige marveled at the wonders around her. Butterflies with wings that sparkled like jewels flitted from flower to flower. The stream seemed to sing a gentle lullaby as it flowed. And was it her imagination, or did the flowers turn to follow their progress, like sunflowers tracking the sun? They came to a small clearing bathed in moonlight. Elliot turned to her, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. "I want to show you something," he said. "A little spell I've been working on. I thought you might enjoy it." Paige nodded encouragingly, curious to see what Elliot had planned. Elliot took a deep breath, then waved his hands in an intricate pattern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the flowers around them began to sway, even though there was no breeze. The movement became more pronounced, and suddenly, the flowers were dancing, twirling and bobbing in a delightful botanical ballet. Paige laughed in delight, spinning in place to take it all in. "Elliot, this is amazing." Encouraged by her reaction, Elliot's movements became more elaborate. The flowers responded, their dance becoming more complex. Roses waltzed with daisies, sunflowers tangoed with tulips, and a group of daffodils performed what looked suspiciously like the can-can. But then, something went awry. A particularly enthusiastic sunflower spun out of control, colliding with a rose bush. There was a moment of floral confusion, and then, to Paige and Elliot's astonishment, a large bouquet of mixed flowers uprooted itself and began to bounce away. "Oh no," Elliot groaned. "Come back here." What followed was a comedy of errors as Paige and Elliot chased the runaway bouquet through the garden. It led them on a merry chase, bouncing over bridges, ducking under bushes, and at one point, cheekily splashing through the stream, soaking them both. Paige, who once would have been mortified by such chaos, found herself laughing harder than she had in years. She and Elliot split up, trying to outflank the mischievous flowers, calling out to each other as they spotted their quarry. "There. By the fountain. Quick, it's heading for the rose arbor." At one point, Paige dove to catch the bouquet, only to come up with a handful of leaves and a face full of grass. Elliot's attempts to magically corral the flowers only seemed to egg them on, as if they were enjoying this game of floral tag. Finally, after what seemed like hours of hijinks, they cornered the bouquet near a moonlit pond. Elliot reached out, ready to grab it, when suddenly he slipped on a patch of wet grass. He windmilled his arms, trying to keep his balance, but it was too late. With a yelp, he toppled into the pond, pulling Paige in with him. They surfaced, sputtering and soaked, to find the bouquet floating innocently nearby, as if it hadn't just led them on a wild goose chase through the garden. For a moment, they just stared at each other, dripping and disheveled. Then, Paige began to giggle. The giggles turned into chuckles, which became full-blown laughter. Elliot joined in, and soon they were clutching each other in the shallow water, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. "I'm so sorry," Elliot gasped between laughs. "This isn't quite how I imagined our romantic evening going." Paige wiped tears of mirth from her eyes. "Are you kidding? This is the most fun I've had in ages." As their laughter subsided, they became aware of their close proximity. Elliot's arms were around Paige's waist, steadying her in the water. Her hands rested on his chest, feeling his heartbeat through his soaked shirt. The moonlight sparkled on the water droplets in Elliot's hair, making him look almost ethereal. Paige felt her breath catch in her throat as she met his gaze. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, Elliot leaned in. Their lips met in a soft, sweet kiss that sent tingles through Paige's entire body. It was a moment both magical and perfectly mundane, two people, connecting under the moonlight, surrounded by the beauty of nature. When they parted, Paige opened her eyes to find that the flowers around the pond had burst into bloom, their petals glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. The runaway bouquet floated closer, almost apologetically, and gently bumped against Paige's arm. "I think they approve," Elliot said softly, a smile playing on his lips. Paige laughed, reaching out to stroke the flower's petals. "I think I do too," she replied, pulling Elliot in for another kiss. They eventually made their way out of the pond, their clothes clinging uncomfortably. But neither of them seemed to mind much. Hand in hand, they wandered through the garden, which seemed to have settled down after its earlier excitement. Now, it felt as if the entire garden was holding its breath, creating a magical bubble just for them. As they walked, Paige found herself opening up to Elliot in a way she never had with anyone before. She told him about her childhood, constantly moving from town to town with her parents' work, never staying in one place long enough to form deep connections. "That's why I love the library so much," she explained. "Books were the one constant in my life. No matter where we moved, I could always find a library and feel at home." Elliot listened attentively, occasionally using his magic to create small, whimsical illustrations of her stories, a tiny house that transformed to show all the places she'd lived, a book whose pages fluttered like wings to represent her love of reading. In turn, Elliot shared more about his life in the magical realm. He spoke of the wonders he'd seen, but also of the loneliness he'd felt, always slightly out of step with both the magical and non-magical worlds. "That's why I came to Stardust," he said. "I was looking for a place where I could bridge those two worlds. Where magic could enhance the everyday, rather than overshadow it." As he spoke, the fairy lights in the trees seemed to glow brighter, as if the garden itself was listening and approving of his words. They found themselves in a small gazebo, its white-painted wood gleaming in the moonlight. As they sat on the bench, Elliot waved his hand, and their walk back through the garden was quiet, but comfortable. The path seemed to illuminate itself before them, soft light guiding their way. As they neared the garden's entrance, Paige turned for one last look, trying to commit every magical detail to memory. "Don't worry," Elliot said softly, understanding her unspoken thought. "The garden will welcome you back anytime you wish to visit. You're part of its magic now." As they emerged back onto the streets of Stardust, Paige was struck by how ordinary everything looked. And yet, she knew that just beneath the surface, magic was waiting to be discovered. They walked back to Paige's apartment, hand in hand, occasionally stopping to share a kiss or simply enjoy the night air. When they reached her door, Paige found herself reluctant to say goodbye. "I had a wonderful time tonight," she said, looking up at Elliot. He smiled, his eyes twinkling in the streetlight. "Even with the impromptu swim?" Paige laughed. "Especially with the impromptu swim. It was perfect, Elliot. All of it." As they shared one last kiss goodnight, Paige felt a warmth spreading through her chest. It was more than just the flutter of new romance. It was the feeling of finding something she didn't even know she'd been missing, a sense of wonder, of possibility, of magic in the everyday. Elliot waited until she was safely inside before heading home. As Paige got ready for bed, she found herself humming softly, a tune she didn't recognize but that somehow reminded her of the garden's babbling stream and swaying flowers. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, the magical bouquet on her nightstand filling her dreams with dancing flowers and moonlit ponds. Tomorrow would bring a return to her routine at the library, but Paige knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. As she drifted off, a small part of her wondered how she would balance this new magical world with her orderly life at the library. The thought of mixing Elliot's unpredictable magic with her carefully organized books both excited and slightly terrified her. Chapter 6, Sweet Chaos. Monday morning arrived with a jolt as Paige's alarm clock chirped insistently. For a moment, she lay in bed, the events of the previous evening swirling in her mind like a pleasant dream. The magical garden, the runaway flowers, the moonlit kiss, it all seemed too wonderful to be real. But the bouquet on her nightstand, still faintly glowing, was proof that magic had indeed entered her life. As she went about her morning routine, Paige found herself humming, a spring in her step that hadn't been there before. Even the thought of Monday at the library, usually a day of returns and restocking, couldn't dampen her spirits. She was just about to leave for work when her phone buzzed with a text from Abigail. "Emergency at the bistro. Need volunteers for community event today. Any chance you're free after work? Bring Elliot if you can." Paige hesitated for just a moment before replying. "Count me in. I'll ask Elliot and let you know." As she walked to work, Paige sent a quick message to Elliot explaining the situation. His response came almost immediately. "Sounds fun. I'll meet you at the library after you finish work. P.S. Watch out for any mischievous books today." Wink. The day at the library passed in a blur of activity. Paige found herself constantly distracted, her mind wandering to thoughts of Elliot and the adventure that awaited them. She caught herself more than once staring dreamily at the children's section, remembering the chaos and joy of Saturday's magical story time. As closing time approached, Paige rushed through her final tasks, her excitement building. She had just finished locking up when she saw Elliot approaching, a wide grin on his face and a small potted plant in his hands. "What's that for?" Paige asked, eyeing the plant curiously. Elliot's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Just a little something to liven up the bistro. Trust me?" Paige laughed, shaking her head fondly. "I'm learning to," she replied, taking his free hand in hers as they set off towards Beanstalk Bistro. The scene that greeted them at the bistro was one of controlled chaos. Abigail flitted about like a silver-haired hummingbird, directing volunteers and somehow managing to look both frazzled and utterly in her element. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," Abigail exclaimed, pulling Paige and Elliot into a flowery embrace. "We're hosting a bake sale for the Children's Hospital, but our star baker called in sick. I need you two on cupcake duty." Before they could protest, Abigail had whisked them into the kitchen, tying aprons around their waists and shoving recipe cards into their hands. Abigail," Paige started hesitantly, "I'm not sure we're the best choice for this. I can barely make toast without burning it." Elliot nodded in agreement. "And my cooking skills are, well, let's say they're more theoretical than practical." Abigail waved away their concerns. "Nonsense. Between Paige's ability to follow instructions and Elliot's creative flair, I'm sure you'll do wonderfully." Now, get baking." With that, she was gone, leaving Paige and Elliot staring at each other in bemused silence. "Well," Elliot said finally, rolling up his sleeves, "how hard can it be?" As it turned out, quite hard indeed. Their first batch of cupcakes emerged from the oven looking more like sad, deflated balloons than the fluffy confections pictured in the recipe book. The second batch somehow managed to be simultaneously burnt on the outside and raw in the middle. "Maybe we should try a different approach," Elliot suggested, eyeing the smoking remains of their third failed attempt. Paige nodded, wiping a smear of flour from her cheek. "I'm open to suggestions. Unless you're thinking of using magic, in which case I'm not sure that's a good idea." Elliot's eyes lit up. "Actually, that's exactly what I was thinking." "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Before Paige could protest further, Elliot had pulled out the small potted plant he'd brought with him. With a flourish, he placed it next to the oven and began to whisper to it, his fingers dancing in intricate patterns. To Paige's amazement, the plant began to grow, its vines snaking out to wrap around the oven. The metal surface began to shimmer and change, taking on a warm, wooden appearance. When the transformation was complete, the oven looked like something out of a fairy tale, with delicate floral patterns etched into its surface and a faint, golden glow emanating from within. "Elliot," Paige said slowly, "what did you do?" He grinned, looking immensely pleased with himself. "I've enchanted the oven. Now it'll bake perfect cupcakes every time. All we have to do is put in the ingredients, and it'll take care of the rest." Paige eyed the oven warily. "Are you sure this is safe?" "Absolutely," Elliot assured her. "Well, mostly sure." "Okay, about 75% sure. But that's a passing grade, right?" Before Paige could voice her concerns, Abigail poked her head into the kitchen. "How's it going in here?" "Oh my, what a lovely oven. Did you redecorate?" "Just a little magical enhancement," Elliot said smoothly. "We'll have those cupcakes ready in no time." Abigail beamed. "Wonderful. The guests are starting to arrive, so the sooner the better." As soon as she left, Paige and Elliot set to work, mixing ingredients with renewed vigor. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm. Paige measured and mixed with precision, while Elliot added pinches of exotic spices and what he called a dash of whimsy. The first batch went into the enchanted oven, which hummed and glowed, releasing the most heavenly scent of baking cupcakes. Paige and Elliot high-fived, feeling confident in their success. But as the timer dinged and Elliot reached to open the oven door, things took an unexpected turn. The door flew open of its own accord, and out hopped a dozen perfectly formed cupcakes. Literally hopped. "Elliot," Paige said, her voice a mixture of awe and alarm, "why are the cupcakes moving?" Elliot watched, mouth agape, as the cupcakes bounced around the kitchen, leaving trails of frosting in their wake. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "But you have to admit, they look delicious." What followed was a scene of utter culinary chaos. Paige and Elliot chased the frolicking cupcakes around the kitchen, trying to corral them onto serving trays. But for every cupcake they caught, two more seemed to hop out of the oven. "We have to stop this," Paige cried, diving to catch a particularly acrobatic red velvet cupcake. Elliot nodded, his hair dusted with flour and a smear of chocolate frosting on his cheek. "You're right. Stand back, I'm going to try to reverse the spell." But as he raised his hands to cast the counterspell, he slipped on a patch of spilled batter. His magic went awry, hitting a bag of flour instead of the oven. The flour exploded in a cloud of white, coating everything, and everyone, in the kitchen. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, Paige began to laugh. It started as a giggle, then grew into a full-bodied laugh that shook her entire frame. Elliot joined in, and soon they were leaning against each other, weak with laughter, surrounded by hopping cupcakes and covered in flour. "Oh, Elliot," Paige gasped between giggles, "what are we going to do?" Before he could answer, the kitchen door burst open. Abigail stood there, taking in the scene with wide eyes. Behind her, a crowd of curious guests peered into the kitchen. For a horrible moment, Paige was sure they were in trouble. But then, a small child pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the bouncing cupcakes. "Wow," he exclaimed. "Magic cupcakes. Can I have one, please?" Abigail's surprised expression melted into a warm smile. "Well," she said, turning to the crowd, "it looks like we have a very special treat for you all today." To Paige and Elliot's amazement, the guests loved the enchanted cupcakes. Children chased them around the bistro, shrieking with delight. Adults marveled at the perfect texture and flavor, declaring them the best cupcakes they'd ever tasted. As the event continued, Paige and Elliot worked side by side, serving cupcakes and cleaning up the kitchen. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, Paige found herself having more fun than she'd had in years. "You know," she said to Elliot as they wiped frosting from each other's faces, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad things didn't go according to plan." Elliot grinned, his eyes twinkling. "That's the beauty of magic, Paige. It rarely goes according to plan, but it always leads to something wonderful." As the night was still young, and Paige found herself looking forward to whatever magical adventure might come next. With Elliot by her side, she was ready to embrace the beautiful chaos that came with a life touched by magic. Chapter 7, A Feast of Laughter. The week following the cupcake chaos at Beanstalk Bistro passed in a whirlwind of stolen moments and shared smiles for Paige and Elliot. Each day brought a new magical surprise: origami birds delivering love notes during Paige's lunch break, flowers that bloomed in Elliot's footsteps as he walked her home, and once, memorably, a rain of chocolate kisses that had the entire town talking for days. By Friday, Paige was both exhilarated and exhausted. The constant influx of magic in her once orderly life was thrilling, but she found herself craving a quiet moment to catch her breath. It was in this spirit that she invited Elliot over for dinner at her apartment. "Just a simple, quiet evening," she told him over the phone. "No magic necessary." Elliot's chuckle crackled through the line. "Are you sure? I could whip up a feast fit for royalty with just a wave of my hand." Paige laughed, shaking her head even though he couldn't see her. "I'm sure. Let's just have a normal dinner for once. I'll cook." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You'll cook?" Elliot's voice was a mix of surprise and something that sounded suspiciously like concern. "Hey. I'm not that bad," Paige protested, though her burning of toast that very morning somewhat undermined her argument. "Okay, maybe we could cook together. But still, no magic. Deal?" "Deal," Elliot agreed, the smile evident in his voice. "See you at 7. As soon as she hung up, Paige began to panic. What had she been thinking, offering to cook? Her culinary skills were limited at best, and the idea of cooking for Elliot, who could probably conjure up gourmet meals with a snap of his fingers, was suddenly terrifying. She spent the next few hours in a frenzy of cleaning and preparation. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, her apartment was spotless, the table was set with her best dishes, and she had managed to assemble the ingredients for what she hoped would be a passable pasta dish. The knock on her door came precisely at 7. Paige took a deep breath, smoothed down her dress, and opened the door with a smile. Elliot stood there, looking handsome in a casual button-down shirt and jeans. In his hands was a bouquet of flowers that seemed to shimmer and change colors as Paige watched. "These are for you," he said, handing her the bouquet. "Don't worry, they're not enchanted." "Well, not much anyway." Paige laughed, accepting the flowers and ushering him inside. "They're beautiful, thank you. And I appreciate the minimal enchantment." As she put the flowers in water, she couldn't help but notice Elliot looking around her apartment with interest. It was the first time he'd been here, and she suddenly saw her space through new eyes. The overflowing bookshelves, the cozy reading nook by the window, the carefully organized desk, it was all so quintessentially her. "I love it," Elliot said, as if reading her thoughts. "It's exactly how I imagined your place would be." Paige felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thanks. It's not much, but it's home." They moved to the kitchen, where Paige had laid out the ingredients for their meal. "I thought we could make pasta together," she explained. It seemed simple enough. Elliot nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Sounds perfect. Where do we start?" What followed was a comedy of errors that would have been at home in any slapstick routine. Paige, in her nervousness, managed to spill flour all over herself while trying to make the pasta dough. Elliot, in an attempt to help, ended up with egg on his face, literally. By the time they had something resembling pasta dough, they were both laughing so hard they could barely stand. "Maybe we should have gone with magic after all," Paige giggled, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. Elliot grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know, it's not too late. I could still whip up something spectacular." Paige hesitated. On one hand, she had wanted a normal, non-magical evening. On the other hand, their attempts at cooking had already turned the night into anything but normal. "Oh, all right," she said finally. "Show me what you've got, wizard." Elliot's face lit up with excitement. He rolled up his sleeves and wiggled his fingers dramatically. "Prepare to be amazed, my dear librarian." With a series of elaborate gestures and muttered incantations, Elliot set the kitchen into motion. Pots and pans danced through the air, ingredients measured and mixed themselves, and the oven preheated with a cheery whistle. Paige watched in amazement as a gourmet meal began to take shape before her eyes. The pasta dough smoothed itself out and cut into perfect fettuccine noodles. A creamy sauce bubbled on the stove, filling the air with a mouth-watering aroma. Even the salad prepared itself, vegetables chopping and tossing in midair. "Elliot, this is incredible!" Paige exclaimed, ducking as a wooden spoon flew past her head to stir the sauce. Elliot beamed, clearly in his element. "Just wait until you taste it. I've added a few magical herbs that should make this a meal to remember." As the final touches were being put on their magical feast, Paige set about lighting candles and pouring wine. The atmosphere in her small apartment had transformed from cozy to downright enchanting. Finally, everything was ready. Steaming plates of fettuccine alfredo, garnished with herbs that seemed to sparkle, sat before them. A fresh salad, its greens impossibly crisp, waited in a crystal bowl. Even the bread looked magical, its crust golden and perfectly crackled. "This looks amazing," Paige said, picking up her fork. "I can't wait to try it." But as she moved to take her first bite, something extraordinary happened. The fettuccine noodles on her plate began to wiggle and squirm, twisting away from her fork. Elliot?" Paige said, her voice a mix of amusement and alarm. "Is the pasta supposed to be moving?" Elliot looked up from his own plate, his eyes widening in surprise. "Definitely not. That's new." Suddenly, a small voice piped up from Paige's plate. "Excuse me, but we'd rather not be eaten, if it's all the same to you." Paige dropped her fork with a clatter, staring in disbelief at her talking dinner. "Elliot," she said slowly, "why is my food talking?" Before Elliot could answer, the salad chimed in. "We agree with the pasta. We may be delicious, but we have feelings too, you know." What followed was a scene of culinary chaos that put their earlier cooking mishaps to shame. The fettuccine noodles slithered off their plates, the salad leaves fluttered around the room like confused butterflies, and the bread rolls bounced off the table, singing a jaunty tune about the joys of not being eaten. Paige and Elliot sat in stunned silence for a moment, watching their dinner make a break for freedom. Then, catching each other's eye, they burst into uncontrollable laughter. "I'm so sorry," Elliot gasped between fits of giggles. "I think I may have overdone it with those magical herbs." Paige wiped tears of mirth from her eyes. You think, she said, ducking as a particularly enthusiastic bread roll bounced past her head. As their laughter subsided, they surveyed the chaos around them. Noodles were draped over lampshades, salad leaves had nested in Paige's bookshelves, and the bread rolls were staging what looked like a miniature Broadway musical on the coffee table. Well, Paige said, a smile still tugging at her lips, I guess we're not having pasta for dinner. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, looking sheepish. I could try to undo the spell, he offered. Paige considered this for a moment, then shook her head. No, I think we've had enough magical cooking for one night. How about we order a pizza instead? Elliot's face lit up with relief. That sounds perfect. As they waited for their very non-magical pizza to arrive, Paige and Elliot set about trying to corral their animated dinner. It turned into a game, with each of them trying to outdo the other in capturing the most escaped food items. By the time the pizza delivery arrived, they had managed to contain most of the magical meal in various pots and containers. Paige made a mental note to find a way to release them safely later, perhaps in Elliot's magical garden. They settled on the couch with their pizza, both slightly disheveled but grinning from ear to ear. In the background, they could still hear the faint strains of the bread roll's musical number. You know, Paige said, taking a bite of her blessedly non-animate pizza, when I suggested a quiet dinner at home, this wasn't exactly what I had in mind. Elliot chuckled, reaching out to pluck a stray piece of lettuce from her hair. No? And, as she closed the door behind him, Paige leaned against it, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Her apartment was a mess, there was a salad leaf stuck to her ceiling, and she could still hear faint singing coming from the kitchen. But her heart was full, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so happy. Paige fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, dreaming of dancing pasta and Elliot's laugh. As she drifted off, she realized that her once orderly life had become beautifully chaotic, and she wouldn't have it any other way. The magic that Elliot had brought into her world wasn't just about spells and enchantments, it was about love, laughter, and finding joy in the unexpected. However, as the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Paige's peaceful slumber was interrupted by a startling realization. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart racing. In all the excitement of the previous evening, she had completely forgotten about the upcoming library fundraiser she was supposed to be organizing. The event was less than a week away, and she had done almost nothing to prepare. As she scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over a stray bread roll that had escaped the night before, Paige's mind whirled with all the tasks ahead of her. How was she going to pull this off in time? As if in answer to her unspoken question, her phone buzzed with a text from Elliot. Good morning, beautiful. Need any help with that fundraiser you mentioned? I have a few magical ideas that might just save the day. Paige stared at the message, a mix of relief and trepidation washing over her. Elliot's magical solutions had a tendency to create as many problems as they solved. But with so little time and so much to do, did she really have a choice? With a deep breath, she typed out her reply, yes, please. But let's try to keep the magic to a minimum this time, okay? Meet me at the library in an hour. As she hit send, Paige couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to embark on her most challenging magical adventure yet. The combination of her organizational skills and Elliot's unpredictable magic was sure to make this fundraiser an event to remember, for better or for worse. She just hoped the library would still be standing by the end of it all. Chapter 8, Game On. The morning after their chaotic dinner date, Paige found herself at the library, surrounded by a whirlwind of fundraiser planning. Elliot had arrived as promised, his enthusiasm infectious as they brainstormed ideas. It was during a lull in their planning that Elliot's face lit up with sudden inspiration. I've got it, he exclaimed, snapping his fingers. We need a break, and I know just the thing. How would you like to meet my best friend, Jasper? Paige felt a flutter of nerves at the idea of meeting someone important in Elliot's life, but she nodded eagerly. I'd love to. What did you have in mind? Elliot's grin widened. Jasper's a wizard too, but he's also a video game designer. He's been working on this new magical gaming system. Want to give it a try? Before Paige could fully process what she was agreeing to, Elliot had whisked her out of the library and across town to a cozy apartment building. As they approached the door marked J. Finley, Paige smoothed down her hair, suddenly self-conscious. The door swung open before they could knock, revealing a tall, wiry man with messy brown hair and sharp, fox-like features. He wore a graphic tee that seemed to be animating itself, tiny pixelated characters running across the fabric. Elliot. And you must be the famous Paige, Jasper said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Come in, come in. I've got everything set up. Paige found herself ushered into an apartment that looked like a cross between a tech startup and a wizard's workshop. Sleek computer monitors shared space with bubbling potions and ancient tomes. In the center of the living room, a large screen dominated one wall, surrounded by what looked like floating crystals. Welcome to the future of gaming, Jasper announced proudly. Or maybe the past. Time gets a bit wonky when you mix magic and technology. Elliot clapped his friend on the back. Jasper's been working on this for months. It's a fully immersive, magical gaming experience. Paige eyed the setup curiously. How does it work? Jasper's face lit up at the question. Well, you see, we've managed to create a bridge between magical energy and digital interfaces. The crystals act as conduits for your own innate magical ability, even if you're not a practiced wizard. It allows you to interact with the game world in ways never before possible. As Jasper continued his enthusiastic explanation, Paige found her head spinning with terms like thaumaturgical algorithms and arcane pixel shaders. She caught Elliot's eye, and he gave her a reassuring wink. Maybe we should just give it a try? Elliot suggested, cutting off Jasper's technical monologue. Right, Jasper agreed. Let's start with something simple. How about a racing game? Before Paige knew it, she was seated on the couch between Elliot and Jasper, a crystal controller humming gently in her hands. The screen before them burst to life, displaying a fantastical racetrack that twisted and turned through an impossible landscape of floating islands and candy-colored forests. Just think about where you want your car to go, Jasper instructed. The game will do the rest. As the countdown began, Paige felt a surge of excitement. She'd never been much of a gamer, but something about this felt different. When the race started, she was surprised to find her car responding to her thoughts with startling accuracy. What began as a simple race quickly devolved into a hilariously competitive showdown. Paige, to everyone's surprise, including her own, found herself in the lead, her librarian's focus translating unexpectedly well to navigating the chaotic racetrack. Look out for the... Oh no! Elliot yelped as his car was swallowed by a giant, grinning flower. Jasper cackled as he zoomed past. Should have taken that power-up, mate. Paige, caught up in the excitement, stuck out her tongue in concentration as she navigated a particularly tricky turn. To her amazement, her in-game character mirrored the action, blowing a raspberry at Jasper's car as she passed it. Hey! Jasper protested, laughing. I didn't program that. Elliot grinned mischievously. No, but I might have added a little something to make the game more responsive. As the race continued, Elliot's magical enhancements became more apparent and more hilarious. Cars began to sass their drivers, power-ups developed personalities of their own, and the racetrack itself seemed to be offering commentary. Left, darling, left. Paige's car urged as she approached a fork in the road. No, your other left. Jasper's car, meanwhile, had developed a posh British accent and seemed more interested in stopping for tea than winning the race. I say, this speed is most undignified. Shall we pause for a spot of Earl Grey? Elliot, not to be outdone, found his car serenading him with increasingly dramatic opera every time he fell behind. Oh mio babino caro, it warbled as it plunged off a cliff, leaving Elliot in fits of laughter. As they played game after game, each more ridiculous than the last, Paige felt herself relaxing into the joy of the moment. She laughed until her sides hurt, trash-talked with the best of them, much to Elliot and Jasper's delighted surprise, and even managed to win a few rounds. During a particularly chaotic battle royale game, where their characters were more interested in starting a dance party than fighting, Paige caught Elliot watching her with a soft smile. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he replied, his eyes twinkling. "It's just nice to see you like this. Relaxed, having fun." Paige felt a warm glow spread through her chest. "It is fun," she admitted. "I can't remember the last time I laughed this much." Jasper, overhearing their exchange, chimed in. "That's the magic of games, and I don't just mean the literal magic we've got going on here. They bring people together, let you be silly and competitive and creative all at once." As the afternoon wore on into evening, they finally set down their controllers, all three of them exhausted but grinning from ear to ear. "That was incredible," Paige said, stretching out her cramped fingers. "Thank you both for including me." Jasper waved off her thanks with a smile. "Are you kidding? You're welcome here anytime. It's not often I get to see Elliot so thoroughly trounced at magical Mario Kart." Elliot groaned good-naturedly. "I maintain that my car was sabotaged. No one's operatic solo should last through an entire Rainbow Road." As they prepared to leave, Jasper pulled Paige aside. "I'm glad Elliot found you," he said quietly. "I haven't seen him this happy in a long time." Paige felt a lump form in her throat, touched by the sincerity in Jasper's words. "He makes me happy too," she replied. "Even if his magic does have a tendency to, well, turn everything into barely controlled chaos?" Jasper finished with a laugh. "Yeah, that's our Elliot. But it looks like you're handling it pretty well." As they walked home hand in hand, the streets of Stardust bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Paige found herself reflecting on the day. She'd entered Elliot's world more fully than ever before, meeting his best friend, engaging with his type of magic, and she'd loved every minute of it. "Penny for your thoughts?" Elliot asked, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Paige smiled up at him. "I was just thinking about how much my life has changed since I met you. A few weeks ago, I never would have imagined spending an afternoon playing magical video games and loving it." Elliot's face softened. "Do you regret it?" "The changes, I mean." Paige stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Not for a second," she said firmly. "You've brought so much joy and wonder into my life, Elliot. Yes, it's chaotic sometimes, and yes, I still occasionally panic when things get too unpredictable. But I wouldn't trade us, for anything." The look of pure happiness on Elliot's face made Paige's heart soar. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. As they parted, Paige noticed that the streetlights around them had begun to glow in soft, shifting rainbow colors. "Oops," Elliot said sheepishly. "Sometimes my magic reacts to strong emotions." Paige laughed, linking her arm through his as they continued their walk. "I like it," she said. "It's like the world is celebrating with us." As they neared Paige's apartment, their conversation turned back to the upcoming library fundraiser. The break had done wonders for their creativity, and ideas were flowing freely. "What if we combined some of Jasper's magical gaming tech with a literary theme?" Paige suggested excitedly. Chapter 9, A Storybook Adventure. The day of the children's scavenger hunt dawned bright and clear, a perfect Saturday morning. Paige arrived at the library early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. This event was a trial run of sorts, a smaller-scale version of the magical elements they planned to incorporate into the upcoming fundraiser. As she unlocked the library doors, Paige took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever magical mayhem the day might bring. She had barely finished setting up the welcome table when Elliot burst through the doors, his arms laden with mysterious packages and his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Good morning, beautiful," he greeted her with a quick kiss. "Ready to make some magic?" Paige couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. As ready as I'll ever be. Just remember, we agreed to keep things under control, right? No runaway story characters or talking furniture this time. Elliot nodded solemnly, though the sparkle in his eyes somewhat undermined his serious expression. Of course, of course. Everything will be perfectly under control. As they worked together to set up the scavenger hunt stations around the library, Paige found herself marveling at how seamlessly their skills complemented each other. Her meticulous organization and knowledge of the library's layout provided the perfect framework for Elliot's creative magical touches. At the first station, Elliot enchanted a large storybook to act as the hunt's narrator. The book's pages fluttered of their own accord, and a warm, grandfatherly voice emerged from its depths, ready to guide the children through their adventure. Is that Merlin? Paige asked, recognizing the voice from an old animated movie. Elliot grinned sheepishly. I may have borrowed a bit of inspiration. Don't worry, I got permission, sort of. Before Paige could inquire further about the legalities of magically appropriating cartoon voices, the first families began to arrive. Children of all ages streamed into the library, their eyes wide with wonder as they took in the transformed space. Paige cleared her throat, stepping forward to address the gathering crowd. Welcome, everyone, to our storybook adventure scavenger hunt. Today, we'll be exploring the magical world of literature in a whole new way. Are you ready to begin? A chorus of excited yes filled the air, and with a nod from Paige, Elliot activated the enchanted book. Greetings, young adventurers, the book's voice boomed, causing a few of the younger children to jump in surprise. Today, you will embark on a quest through the realms of story and imagination. Your first challenge awaits in the land of fairy tales. Seek out the glass slipper, but beware, not everything is as it seems. The children scattered, laughing and chattering as they raced towards the fairy tale section. Paige and Elliot exchanged a grin before hurrying after them to supervise and assist. In the fairy tale section, Elliot had outdone himself. Tiny, glowing fairies flitted between the bookshelves, sprinkling magical dust that made the book covers shimmer and move. A collection of glass slippers sat on a display, each one magically changing size and style as the children approached. Remember, Elliot called out to the giggling group, you're looking for Cinderella's slipper. It'll be the one that feels just right. As the children took turns trying on the magical shoes, Paige watched in amusement as one little boy slipped on a particularly sparkly pair, only to find himself suddenly sporting a frilly ball gown. Oh my, Paige murmured, trying to stifle her laughter. Elliot winked at her. What? Every prince should have the chance to feel pretty. The boy, far from being upset, twirled in delight, his friends clapping and asking for turns with the dress-up slipper. Once the correct slipper was found, it fit everyone perfectly and filled the wearer with an urge to dance. The enchanted book spoke again, directing the children to their next challenge in the mystery section. Here, Elliot had created a miniature crime scene, complete with tiny magnifying glasses that revealed hidden clues. The bookshelves themselves got in on the action, whispering hints and red herrings to the young detectives. The butler did it, one shelf insisted, while another contradicted. No, it was the maid with the candlestick. Paige found herself getting caught up in the excitement, helping the children piece together the clues. She was so engrossed that she almost didn't notice when one of the mystery novels began to smoke ominously. Elliot, she hissed, pointing at the book. Oops, he muttered, quickly waving his hand to dispel the magical buildup. Got a bit too into the noir atmosphere there. As the morning wore on, each section of the library revealed new wonders. In the adventure area, a magical map led the children on a treasure hunt through literary landscapes. The science fiction shelves became a starship bridge, complete with bleeping consoles and a view of alien worlds through the windows. But it was in the fantasy section that Elliot's magic truly shone. As the children entered the area, they found themselves surrounded by a misty forest. Paige gasped in wonder as familiar characters stepped out from behind the trees, a fawn with an umbrella, a young boy with a lightning scar, a girl in a blue dress followed by a grinning cat. Elliot, Paige whispered, her eyes wide, this is incredible. How did you manage all this? He smiled, slipping an arm around her waist. Magic is all about imagination, Paige. And what has more imagination than children's literature? I just gave it a little push to become real. As they watched, the storybook characters began to interact with the children, offering riddles and challenges. Paige's heart swelled as she saw the pure joy on the faces of both the kids and their parents. You know, she said softly, when I became a librarian, this is what I always hoped to do, but bring stories to life for children. I just never imagined it could be so literal. Elliot squeezed her gently. That's why we make such a great team. You have the heart and the knowledge, I just provide a little magical flair. Their moment was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the spell books, which Paige had insisted on keeping behind a velvet rope. A group of older kids had managed to open one of the books, and now sparks were flying as they attempted to pronounce the incantations within. No, no, no. Elliot called out, rushing over. That's not how you, watch out for that. Poof. A cloud of purple smoke engulfed the children. When it cleared, Paige saw with a mixture of horror and amusement that the kids had been transformed into various magical creatures. One boy sported a pair of donkey ears, while a girl was examining her new scaly dragon tail with delight. Elliot, Paige said, her voice strained, please tell me you can fix this before their parents see. Elliot was already waving his hands, muttering counter spells. Of course, of course. Just a minor hiccup. All part of the magical experience. By the time the smoke cleared again, the children were back to normal, though the girl with the dragon tail looked slightly disappointed. As the scavenger hunt drew to a close, Paige gathered everyone in the main reading area for a final surprise. Elliot had prepared a magical story time, where the book's illustrations would come to life as Paige read aloud. Settling into the reading chair, Paige opened the oversized book on her lap and began to read. Once upon a time, in a land not so different from our own. As she spoke, the air above the book shimmered, and 3D images began to form. A castle rose from mist, dragons soared overhead, and brave knights battled fearsome monsters. The children oohed and awed, completely captivated by the spectacle. Paige found herself getting lost in the story too, her voice rising and falling with the action. She felt a warmth in her chest as she realized that this magical melding of stories and reality, was everything she'd ever dreamed of as a librarian. As she reached the story's climax, she looked up to find Elliot watching her, a soft smile on his face. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Paige felt a connection that went beyond their shared love of magic and books. This was partnership, in every sense of the word. With the last words of the end, the magical images faded away, leaving behind a room full of wide-eyed, grinning children and equally impressed adults. That was amazing, one little girl exclaimed, bouncing in her seat. Can we do it again? Paige laughed, closing the book. I think that's enough magic for one day. But don't worry, there's always more adventure waiting for you in every book on these shelves. As the families began to file out, full of excited chatter about their favorite parts of the hunt, Paige and Elliot set about cleaning up the magical remnants of the day. Books flew back to their proper places, magical mist dissipated, and slowly, the library returned to its usual state, though Paige fancied she could still see a hint of sparkle in the air. Well, Elliot, Paige said, breaking the comfortable silence, I've been thinking about the upcoming fundraiser. What if we combine your magical art with some of the children's favorite stories? We could bring beloved characters to life throughout the library. Elliot's eyes lit up with excitement. That's a brilliant idea. We could have Alice in Wonderland characters hosting a tea party in one corner, and maybe Peter Pan flying around the ceiling. Paige nodded enthusiastically, her mind already racing with possibilities. And we could set up a magical treasure hunt, like we did today, but on a grander scale. Each book could hold a clue to the next. As they continued to brainstorm, their voices filled with laughter and shared excitement, neither of them noticed how late it had become. The library, usually so quiet and orderly, seemed to hum with the potential of their plans, as if the books themselves were eager to be part of the magical event to come. Chapter 10, Spells and Sunsets. The week following the successful children's scavenger hunt flew by in a whirlwind of fundraiser planning and magical mishaps. Paige found herself juggling her regular librarian duties with increasingly elaborate plans for enchanted book displays and interactive literary experiences. Elliot, for his part, spent his days experimenting with new spells, often leaving a trail of whimsical chaos in his wake. By the time Saturday rolled around, Paige was in desperate need of a break. When Elliot suggested a picnic in the park, she jumped at the chance for some fresh air and relaxation. The day was perfect, warm sunshine, a gentle breeze, and the park in full bloom. They found a quiet spot near the pond, spreading out a checkered blanket and unpacking a basket full of sandwiches, fruit, and what appeared to be color-changing lemonade. "Elliot," Paige said, eyeing the shimmering drink, "please tell me this lemonade isn't going to turn me into a frog or something." Elliot laughed, pouring her a glass. "No amphibian transformations, I promise. It just changes flavor based on your mood. Give it a try." Paige took a cautious sip and was pleasantly surprised by a burst of sweet strawberry. "Oh. That's actually delightful." "Strawberry means you're happy," Elliot explained with a wink. "I was hoping for that one." As they ate, sharing stories about their week and brainstorming ideas for the fundraiser, Paige couldn't help but notice Elliot fidgeting, a telltale sign that he had something on his mind. "All right," she said, setting down her sandwich. "What's got you so antsy?" Elliot's face broke into an excited grin. "Well, I've been thinking. You've seen so much of my magic, but you've never really had a chance to try it yourself. How would you feel about a little magic lesson?" Paige felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation flutter in her stomach. "Me? Do magic? I don't know, Elliot. I'm not exactly wizarding material." Elliot reached out, taking her hand in his. "Nonsense. Magic is in everything and everyone. Some of us just have a knack for tapping into it more easily. But I bet with a little practice, you could surprise yourself." His enthusiasm was contagious, and Paige found herself nodding. "Okay, why not? What's the worst that could happen?" Elliot's eyes twinkled mischievously. "That's the spirit. Now, let's start with something simple." He plucked a dandelion from the grass, holding it out to her. "Magic is all about intention and visualization. I want you to focus on this dandelion. Imagine its seeds lifting off, floating in the air. Really see it in your mind. Then, when you're ready, blow on it and think the word of fly you thought." Paige took the dandelion, feeling slightly foolish but determined to give it a try. She closed her eyes, picturing the delicate seeds lifting off. Taking a deep breath, she blew gently on the flower, thinking a fly as hard as she could. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, to her amazement, the dandelion seeds began to lift off, but instead of floating away, they swirled around her head in a playful dance before settling back onto the stem, reforming the flower. "I did it!" Paige exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Elliot, did you see that?" Elliot was beaming with pride. "I knew you could do it. That was excellent for a first try. Want to try something a little more challenging?" Buoyed by her success, Paige nodded eagerly. For the next hour, Elliot guided her through various simple spells. She managed to make a pebble skip across the pond without touching it, caused a nearby flower to change color, though it ended up a rather psychedelic swirl instead of the intended blue, and even conjured a small spark between her fingertips. Each small success filled Paige with a growing sense of wonder. She had always loved the idea of magic, but to actually feel it flowing through her, to see the world respond to her intentions, was beyond anything she had imagined. This is incredible, she breathed, watching the spark dance between her fingers. Is this how you feel all the time? Elliot nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? But you know what's even more incredible? Seeing that look of wonder on your face. It reminds me of why I fell in love with magic in the first place. As the lesson progressed, Paige found herself relaxing into the magic, marveling at the way it seemed to flow through her. It wasn't the grand, flashy magic Elliot often performed, but it was undeniably real and thrilling. You're a natural, Elliot said, his voice warm with affection. Ready to try something a bit more complex? Paige, flushed with success and the joy of discovery, nodded enthusiastically. What did you have in mind? Elliot gestured towards the pond, where a group of ducks were paddling lazily. Transformation spells are tricky, but incredibly useful. Let's see if we can give one of those ducks a little makeover. He walked her through the incantation and wand movement, using a stick as a makeshift wand, emphasizing the importance of clear visualization. Remember, he said, you have to really see the change you want to make. Every detail, from the shape of the beak to the texture of the feathers. Paige took a deep breath, focusing on one of the ducks. She pictured it transforming, its neck elongating, its feathers turning pristine white. With a wave of her stick wand, she spoke the incantation, feeling the magic surge through her. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a puff of pink smoke, the duck began to change. Its neck stretched, its feathers whitened, but something wasn't quite right. When the smoke cleared, they were faced with a creature that was unmistakably more swan-like, but still had the head and quack of a duck. The duck swan looked at itself in the water's reflection, let out a confused quack, and then began to paddle in circles, clearly baffled by its new, elongated body. Paige clapped a hand over her mouth, torn between horror at her magical mishap and amusement at the absurd sight. Elliot, on the other hand, burst into laughter. Oh, that's brilliant, he gasped between chuckles. A duck swan. I couldn't have done it better myself. His laughter was infectious, and soon Paige found herself giggling too. We have to change it back, she managed to say. The poor thing looks so confused. What followed was a hilarious chase around the pond as they tried to corner the duck swan to reverse the spell. The creature, apparently enjoying its new form, led them on a merry chase, alternating between graceful swan-like glides and comical duck-like waddles. Other park-goers stopped to watch the spectacle, some cheering for the duck swan, others offering well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice. Try offering it bread, one elderly lady called out. Bread? Elliot panted as he made another grab for the elusive bird. We're trying to catch it, not feed it. A group of children joined in the chase, turning it into an impromptu game of tag with the duck swan as the unwitting leader. Paige found herself laughing so hard she could barely breathe as she watched Elliot, usually so composed with his magic, slipping and sliding in the mud by the pond's edge. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, they managed to corral the duck swan long enough for Elliot to reverse the spell. With another puff of smoke, the bird returned to its original duck form, quacking indignantly before swimming off to join its fellows. Paige and Elliot collapsed onto the grass, breathless and laughing. Well, Paige said once she could speak again, I guess I still have a lot to learn about magic. Elliot propped himself up on one elbow, grinning down at her. Are you kidding? That was amazing. Do you know how long it took me to perform my first transformation spell? And it certainly wasn't as entertaining as yours. As they lay there, catching their breath and recounting the duck swan's antics, Paige felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. This was what had been missing from her life, this sense of wonder, of joyful unpredictability, of magic in the everyday world. Thank you, Elliot, she said softly, reaching out to take his hand. For sharing this with me. For showing me that there's magic everywhere, if you know how to look for it. Elliot's expression softened, his eyes filled with an emotion that made Paige's heart skip a beat. Thank you for being willing to learn, he replied. for embracing the chaos and the wonder. You know, in all my years of practicing magic, I've never enjoyed it as much as I do when I'm sharing it with you. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Elliot sat up with a sudden inspiration. I have an idea. As they finally packed up their picnic and prepared to head home, Paige felt as if she was walking on air. The magic of the day had left her feeling more alive, more connected to the world around her than ever before. So, Elliot said as they strolled hand in hand through the darkening park, same time next week for another magic lesson? Paige laughed, squeezing his hand. Absolutely. Though maybe next time we stick to spells that don't involve chasing waterfowl around the pond. As they neared the park exit, a gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of magic and possibility. Paige felt a shiver run down her spine, a sense that they were on the cusp of something big. Elliot, she said, her voice thoughtful, for the fundraiser, what do you think about incorporating some of Stardust local legends into our magical displays? I've been reading about some fascinating stories that could be amazing if brought to life. Elliot's eyes lit up with excitement. That's a brilliant idea. We could create a sort of magical historical tour through the library. What kind of legends are we talking about? As Paige began to share her research, enthusiastically describing tales of hidden treasures and mysterious figures from the town's past, she felt a surge of creative energy. The combination of local history and magic seemed like the perfect way to make their fundraiser truly special. There's this one story about a magical artifact hidden somewhere in town, Paige explained. Legend has it that it can grant wishes, but only to those who are pure of heart. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could create a magical scavenger hunt based on that? Elliot nodded, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. We could have clues hidden in magically enhanced books, riddles that change based on who's reading them. Oh. And what if we created an illusion of the town as it was in the past? As they walked on, lost in conversation and each other, the very fabric of Stardust seemed to hold its breath. The merger of Paige's knowledge and love for stories with Elliot's magical abilities was creating something new and exciting, something that had the potential to change not just their lives, but the entire town. Chapter 11, Rings and Revelations. The annual Stardust Summer Festival had arrived, transforming the quaint town into a vibrant wonderland of lights, music, and laughter. Colorful banners fluttered in the warm evening breeze, and the air was thick with the scent of cotton candy and grilled corn. Paige stood at the entrance of the festival grounds, smoothing down her sundress nervously. This was her first time attending the festival with Elliot, and she couldn't help but wonder what magical mishaps might ensue. But as she caught sight of him weaving through the crowd towards her, his face lit up with a boyish grin, all her worries melted away. Ready for some fun? Elliot asked, offering her his arm with a theatrical flourish. Paige laughed, linking her arm through his. As ready as I'll ever be. Just promise me we won't end up floating above the Ferris wheel or anything. Elliot's eyes twinkled mischievously. Now where's the fun in making promises like that? As they made their way through the festival, Paige found herself relaxing into the joyful atmosphere. They tried their hand at various games, shared a funnel cake dusted with powdered sugar, which Elliot couldn't resist animating into tiny sugar dancers, and watched in amusement as children chased after balloons that seemed determined to escape. It was as they approached the ring toss booth that things took a turn for the magical. The booth was run by Mr. Finch, the elderly owner of the antique shop, who greeted them with a knowing wink. "Step right up, lovebirds," he called out. "Test your skills and win a prize." Elliot grinned at Paige. "What do you say? Fancy a friendly competition?" Paige felt a spark of her old competitive spirit ignite. "You're on, wizard boy. But no magic." Mr. Finch handed them each a set of rings, his eyes twinkling with an almost magical glint. Now, he said, "where's the fun in that? This is a special game, you see. These rings have a mind of their own. The trick is to guide them with your intentions." Paige and Elliot exchanged a look, both realizing that this was no ordinary ring toss. Elliot went first, closing his eyes and focusing intently before tossing his ring. To Paige's amazement, the ring seemed to wobble in midair, curving impossibly before landing squarely around the neck of a stuffed unicorn. "Show off," Paige muttered good-naturedly. She took a deep breath, trying to channel the focus she'd learned during their magic lessons in the park. As she threw her ring, she could have sworn she felt a tingle of energy coursing through her arm. The ring soared through the air, glowing faintly. For a moment, it looked like it would land perfectly around a giant teddy bear. But at the last second, it seemed to change its mind, looping around and beginning to chase after a small, stuffed dragon instead. "Oh no," Paige gasped, watching as her ring zoomed after the now animated dragon toy. Elliot burst into laughter. "Well, that's certainly one way to win a prize." What followed was a scene of utter chaos that would have the town talking for weeks. Paige and Elliot's rings, apparently having developed minds of their own, began chasing various surprises around the booth and then out into the festival grounds. Stuffed animals took flight, dodging the pursuing rings as festival-goers looked on in amazement. Paige's ring seemed particularly determined to catch the dragon, which was now breathing tiny puffs of cotton candy smoke as it weaved between stalls. Elliot's unicorn, not to be outdone, had grown wings and was now galloping through the air, trailing sparkles and leading Elliot's ring on a merry chase. "Should we do something?" Paige asked, torn between mortification and amusement as she watched a group of children join in the chase, clearly delighted by the magical mayhem. Elliot grinned, grabbing her hand. "Absolutely. We should catch them, of course." And so, hand in hand, they raced after their runaway rings and prizes. They ducked under game booths, weaved through the startled but laughing crowd, and at one point, found themselves tangled in a string of enchanted lights that seemed determined to join in the fun. As they ran, Paige felt a bubble of laughter building in her chest. This was so far from her usual orderly life, and yet she couldn't remember the last time she'd had so much fun. She glanced at Elliot, his hair wild and his eyes sparkling with joy, and felt her heart swell with affection. Their chase led them to the center of the festival, where a large fountain stood. The unicorn and dragon, apparently tired of fleeing, decided to take a swim. As they splashed into the water, the rings finally caught up, looping around their necks triumphantly. Paige and Elliot skidded to a halt at the fountain's edge, breathless and laughing. They were soaked from the splashing prizes, covered in bits of cotton candy and glitter, and the center of attention for the entire festival. "Well," Elliot said, plucking a piece of cotton candy from Paige's hair, "I'd say that was a successful game of ring toss, wouldn't you?" Paige couldn't help it. She burst into peals of laughter, leaning against Elliot for support. "Oh yes," she gasped between giggles, "very successful. I'm sure this is exactly what Mr. Finch had in mind." As if summoned by his name, Mr. Finch appeared beside them, looking utterly unruffled by the chaos. "Well done, you two," he said cheerfully. "I haven't seen a game that exciting in years. I'd say you've both earned your prizes." He fished the now docile unicorn and dragon out of the fountain, handing them to Elliot and Paige respectively. As Paige took her dragon, she could have sworn it winked at her before settling into a normal stuffed animal pose. The crowd that had gathered began to applaud, clearly having enjoyed the impromptu magical show. Paige felt her cheeks heat up, unused to being the center of attention, but Elliot took it all in stride. He bowed dramatically, encouraging Paige to do the same. As the excitement died down and the festival returned to its normal rhythm, Paige and Elliot found a quiet spot on a nearby hill. They sat down on the grass, their prizes nestled between them, and looked out over the twinkling lights of the festival. "I'm sorry if that was too much," Elliot said after a moment, a hint of worry in his voice. "I know you prefer things to be more controlled." Paige turned to him, surprised. "Are you kidding?" "Elliot, that was amazing. I haven't laughed that hard in years." "Really?" The relief in his voice was palpable. "You're not just saying that?" Paige shook her head, reaching out to take his hand. "I'm not just saying it. I'll admit, when we first started dating, all the magical chaos was a bit overwhelming. But now I think I'm starting to see the beauty in it. The joy of the unexpected. Elliot's face softened, his eyes filled with emotion. Paige, you have no idea how happy it makes me to hear you say that. I was so worried that my magic, my whole world, would be too much for you. It is a lot, Paige admitted. But it's also wonderful. You've shown me that there's magic in everyday life, Elliot. Not just in spells and enchantments, but in laughter, in spontaneity, in seeing the world through new eyes. As they sat there, hands intertwined, the festival seemed to fade into the background. The stuffed dragon cuddled up against Paige's leg, while the unicorn nuzzled Elliot's shoulder. It was a perfect moment of harmony between the magical and the mundane. You know, Elliot said softly, I came to Stardust looking for inspiration, for a way to blend my magical world with the ordinary. I never expected to find someone who would inspire me more than any landscape or city ever could. Paige felt her heart skip a beat. And I never thought my orderly life would be turned upside down in the most wonderful way possible. I guess we both found something we didn't know we were looking for. Elliot leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. As they parted, Paige noticed that the festival lights seemed to have grown brighter, twinkling like stars brought down to earth. Oops, Elliot said sheepishly. Sometimes my magic reacts to strong emotions. Paige laughed, snuggling closer to him. I like it, she said. It's like the world is celebrating with us. As they sat together, watching the festival below, Paige found herself thinking about the future. The library fundraiser was coming up, and with it, the challenge of blending her world of books and order with Elliot's magical chaos. But for the first time, she felt truly excited about the prospect, rather than anxious. Elliot, she said, an idea forming, for the fundraiser, what if we created a magical scavenger hunt through the library? Like what we did today, but with books and stories instead of carnival prizes? Elliot's face lit up. That's brilliant. We could have characters from different genres leading people through the library. Maybe a mystery section where people have to The library fundraiser was still weeks away, but Paige had a feeling it would be just the beginning of their greatest adventure yet. And for once, she couldn't wait to step off the beaten path of her carefully ordered life and see where the magic would take them. Chapter 12, The Multiplying Menagerie. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Paige was jolted awake by an insistent tapping at her window. Bleary-eyed, she stumbled out of bed to investigate, only to find a small, iridescent creature that looked like a cross between a rabbit and a hummingbird hovering outside. Elliot, she groaned, recognizing the magical signature of her boyfriend's creations. She opened the window, allowing the creature to zip inside, leaving a trail of sparkles in its wake. No sooner had she closed the window than her phone buzzed with a text from Elliot, surprise. Meet Sparkle, your new magical pet. Don't worry, she's house-trained. I think. Paige couldn't help but smile as she watched Sparkle explore her apartment, chirping melodiously and occasionally teleporting short distances in puffs of glitter. The creature's fur shimmered with every color of the rainbow, changing hues as it moved, and its long ears twitched attentively at every sound. Well, Sparkle, she said, reaching out to pet the creature's soft fur, I suppose we'd better get you checked out by a vet, just to be safe. As if understanding, Sparkle nuzzled Paige's hand affectionately. However, when Paige's fingers brushed against a particularly sparkly patch of fur, there was a sudden pop, and to her horror, Sparkle split into two identical creatures. Oh no, Paige muttered, quickly withdrawing her hand. But it was too late. The two Sparkles, delighted with this new development, began zooming around the room, touching everything they could reach and multiplying with each contact. Within minutes, Paige's orderly apartment was overrun with a dozen chirping, teleporting, glitter-shedding Sparkles. Furniture was upended, books were scattered, and a fine layer of magical sparkles covered every surface. One sparkle had managed to open her closet and was now wearing one of her scarves like a cape, zooming around dramatically. Another had discovered her potted plants and was attempting to nest in them, turning the leaves various shades of purple and blue in the process. In a panic, Paige called Elliot. "Your house-trained pet is replicating itself all over my apartment," she exclaimed as soon as he picked up. "What? Oh no. I must have mixed up the stabilizing potion." Elliot's voice came through, a mix of concern and poorly concealed amusement. "Don't worry, I'll be right there." While waiting for Elliot, Paige attempted to contain the situation. She tried using some of the simple magic Elliot had been teaching her, attempting to create barriers or catch the sparkles in magical bubbles. However, her novice spells were no match for the creature's replicating abilities and teleportation skills. By the time Elliot arrived, the situation had escalated. Paige's apartment now housed at least 30 sparkles, all chirping in a cacophonous chorus and leaving trails of glitter wherever they went. The ceiling fan had become a merry-go-round for a group of particularly adventurous sparkles, while others were engaged in what appeared to be a game of magical tag, teleporting from one piece of furniture to another. "I'm so sorry," Elliot said as he surveyed the chaos, trying and failing to suppress a grin. "I was trying to create the perfect pet for you, something magical but low maintenance." Paige, covered in glitter and looking frazzled, couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. "Well, you certainly achieved the magical part." "Low maintenance?" "Not so much." Elliot joined in her laughter, and soon they were both giggling uncontrollably, surrounded by the whirlwind of magical creatures they'd inadvertently created. It was moments like these, Paige realized, that made their relationship so special, the ability to find joy and humor even in the midst of chaos. Together, they attempted to round up the sparkles, but every time they thought they had them all, they'd find another hiding behind a curtain or inside a lampshade. Elliot tried a few spells to contain them, but the creatures seemed to have developed a resistance to his magic, probably due to being his own creation. "Okay," Elliot said after their third failed attempt, running a hand through his hair and leaving a streak of glitter, "we need a new plan. These little guys are smarter than I anticipated." Paige nodded, trying to brush some of the sparkles off her pajamas. "And more numerous. I swear there are more of them now than there were 5 minutes ago." As if to prove her point, 2 sparkles collided midair, resulting in a pop, and suddenly there were 4 where there had been 2. "I know," Elliot exclaimed, his eyes lighting up with that familiar spark of an idea. "Let's take them to Theo's veterinary clinic. He's used to dealing with unusual cases, and he's got experience with some of my less successful creations." Paige raised an eyebrow. "Less successful than these?" she asked, gesturing to the sparkle currently attempting to redecorate her bookshelf by color-coding the book spines with its touch. Elliot chuckled sheepishly. "Let's just say Theo's seen his fair share of magical mishaps. Come on, help me round them up." With a wave of his wand, which Paige was pretty sure had been a wooden spoon from her kitchen moments before, Elliot conjured a large, magically expandable pet carrier. It looked like a normal cat carrier from the outside, but as they began to usher sparkles into it, Paige could see that the interior expanded to comfortably accommodate all of them. The process of getting all the sparkles into the carrier was nothing short of comical. Paige found herself crawling under furniture, climbing on chairs, and even attempting to lure the creatures with treats, which Elliot magically created, much to the sparkles' delight. Elliot, meanwhile, was engaged in what looked like an elaborate dance, spinning and leaping as he tried to catch the more elusive sparkles in magical nets. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, they managed to corral all the visible sparkles into the carrier. The container emitted a chorus of melodious chirps and occasional pops as new sparkles were inevitably created inside. "Ready?" Elliot asked, hefting the carrier, which despite its magical properties, still seemed to weigh a ton. Paige looked down at herself, still in her pajamas and covered in a layer of magical glitter. "Can I at least change first?" Elliot grinned. "And risk letting any stragglers escape? Besides, you look adorable." The glitter really brings out your eyes. Rolling said eyes, Paige grabbed her keys and followed Elliot out the door, leaving a trail of sparkles in their wake. The walk to Theo's clinic was an adventure in itself. People on the street stopped and stared at the odd couple, Paige in her glitter-covered pajamas, Elliot struggling with a carrier that seemed to be moving of its own accord and emitting a symphony of chirps and pops. A few of the town's children began to follow them, delighted by the occasional puff of glitter that escaped the carrier's air holes. Theo Graham, the town's veterinarian, was just opening up his clinic when Paige and Elliot arrived. His eyebrows shot up as he took in the sight before him. Well, Theo said, a bemused smile playing on his lips. What have we here? Another one of your creations, Elliot? A magical pet emergency, Elliot explained sheepishly. Meet Sparkle, and Sparkle, and Sparkle, and... Theo, to his credit, took the situation in stride. After all, being the veterinarian in a town where one of the residents was a wizard prone to creating magical creatures meant he'd seen his fair share of unusual cases. All right, bring them in. Let's see what we're dealing with. As soon as they opened the carrier in the examination room, sparkles burst forth in a cloud of glitter and fur. They zoomed around the room, multiplying as they touched various surfaces, much to Theo's amazement and Paige's dismay. Fascinating, Theo murmured, watching as one sparkle split into two before his eyes. Some kind of magical mitosis, perhaps? Elliot, what exactly were you aiming for when you created these little ones? As Elliot launched into an explanation of magical genetics and potion mixing, Paige found herself chasing sparkles around the room, trying to prevent them from touching anything and multiplying further. She climbed on examination tables, dove under chairs, and at one point found herself tangled in a stethoscope as she tried to catch a particularly elusive sparkle. A little help here, she called out, balancing precariously on a chair as she reached for a sparkle perched on top of a cabinet. Elliot and Theo snapped into action, and soon the clinic was a scene of controlled chaos as the three of them attempted to wrangle the ever-multiplying creatures. Theo, armed with a butterfly net, was swooping and diving with surprising agility. Elliot was attempting to create magical barriers, though the sparkles seemed to treat these more like fun obstacles than actual impediments. We need to find a way to stop them from replicating, Theo said, ducking as a sparkle zoomed over his head. Elliot, is there a counterspell or something we can try? Elliot's face lit up with sudden inspiration. Of course. While the two men worked, Paige kept Sparkle entertained and contained with a series of small levitation spells she'd been practicing. She found that Sparkle was an eager audience, chirping encouragement as Paige made various small objects float and dance in the air. Finally, Theo and Elliot emerged from their makeshift magical laboratory, looking tired but satisfied. They had created a tiny, glowing collar for Sparkle, which would prevent uncontrolled replication while still allowing the creature to use its other magical abilities. As they prepared to leave, Sparkle now wearing its new accessory and nestled contentedly in a pet carrier that Theo had enchanted to be teleportation-proof, Theo pulled Paige aside. You know, he said with a knowing smile, I've known Elliot for years, and I've never seen him as happy as he is with you. You two make a great team. Paige felt a warm glow in her chest at Theo's words. She looked over at Elliot, who was cooing at Sparkle and promising her all sorts of magical toys, and felt a surge of affection. Thanks, Theo, she said. We're still figuring things out, but I think we're getting there. As they walked home, Sparkle nestled contentedly in its carrier. Paige couldn't help but reflect on the morning's adventure. You know, she said to Elliot, a few months ago, something like this would have sent me into a panic. But now, I kind of enjoyed it. The chaos, the problem-solving, working together. Elliot squeezed her hand, his eyes twinkling. Does this mean you're ready for more magical pets? Because I have some ideas for a fire-breathing goldfish. Paige laughed, shaking her head. Let's stick with Sparkle for now. But I am ready for more adventures with you, magical or otherwise. As they reached Paige's apartment, they found that the magical cleanup spell Elliot had cast before they left had worked wonders. The place was spotless, with only a faint, pleasant shimmer in the air to suggest anything out of the ordinary had occurred. "So," Elliot said as they settled on the couch, Sparkle exploring her new home, "what's next on our magical agenda?" "We still have that fundraiser to plan." Paige's eyes lit up. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. What if we incorporate some of what happened today? Not the uncontrolled replication, obviously, but the idea of magical creatures? We could create a sort of enchanted petting zoo section." As they brainstormed ideas, their excitement building, Paige marveled at how much her life had changed. The orderly, predictable existence she had once clung to now seemed pale in comparison to the vibrant, magical life she shared with Elliot. Sure, there were still challenges. Magical mishaps were an almost daily occurrence, and balancing her need for structure with Elliot's spontaneity was an ongoing process. But as she watched Sparkle curl up for a nap, occasionally emitting tiny puffs of glitter with each snore, Paige knew she wouldn't have it any other way. This was her life now, a beautiful blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary, of books and spells, of careful planning and wonderful surprises. And with Elliot by her side, every day promised to be an adventure. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting rainbow reflections off Sparkle's iridescent fur, Paige and Elliot continued to plan their magical fundraiser, their voices filled with laughter and shared excitement. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities, and Paige couldn't wait to see what magic it would bring. "You know," Elliot said, a thoughtful look on his face, "today made me realize something." "What's that?" Paige asked, curious. "That even when things go completely off the rails, as long as we're together, we can handle anything. You were amazing today, Paige. The way you took charge, how quickly you're learning magic. I'm in awe of you." Paige felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "I had a good teacher," she said softly. "And a great partner." They broke apart, laughing, as Sparkle's glitter shower settled around them. Paige's eyes met Elliot's, and she was about to speak when her phone buzzed insistently. It was a message from the library board about the upcoming fundraiser. "Oh no," Paige groaned, scanning the message. "The board wants to meet tomorrow to discuss our plans. They're concerned about the unconventional elements we've proposed." Elliot's brow furrowed. "That doesn't sound good. What are we going to do?" Paige took a deep breath, her mind already racing with ideas. "I guess we'll have to convince them that a little magic is exactly what this fundraiser needs. Are you ready for our biggest challenge yet?" Chapter 13, Game Night Shenanigans. The library board meeting had gone better than expected, thanks to Paige's meticulous planning and Elliot's charm. With the fundraiser preparations in full swing, they decided it was time for a well-deserved break. Maggie, ever the social butterfly, suggested a double-date game night with her new boyfriend, who turned out to be none other than Elliot's best friend, Jasper. As Paige and Elliot arrived at Maggie's cozy apartment, the air was thick with the scent of buttered popcorn and the promise of adventure. Maggie greeted them with her trademark enthusiasm, her wild red curls bobbing as she ushered them inside. "You're just in time," Maggie exclaimed. "Jasper's setting up the game. You won't believe what he's brought." Paige raised an eyebrow at Elliot, who shrugged innocently. "I may have mentioned that you've been getting more comfortable with magic," he said with a wink. As they entered the living room, Jasper looked up from the coffee table where he was arranging an ornate wooden game board. "Ah, the guests of honor. Ready for a night of enchanted entertainment?" Paige eyed the board curiously. It seemed to shimmer slightly, the intricate patterns etched into its surface shifting and changing as she watched. "What exactly are we playing?" Jasper's eyes twinkled mischievously. "It's called Realms of Wonder. Think of it as a magical version of those adventure board games you're used to. Only in this one, the adventures tend to come to life. Don't worry, Elliot reassured Paige, noticing her slightly apprehensive look. It's perfectly safe. Mostly. Maggie clapped her hands excitedly. Oh, come on, Paige. Where's your sense of adventure? This is going to be so much fun. Unable to resist her friend's infectious enthusiasm, Paige found herself settling onto the floor around the coffee table. All right, I'm in. But if I end up turned into a frog or something, you're all responsible for explaining it to the library board. As Jasper began explaining the rules, the game board suddenly illuminated, projecting a shimmering, three-dimensional map into the air above it. Miniature trees sprouted from forests, tiny waves crashed against shorelines, and minuscule creatures could be seen scurrying about. Wow, Paige breathed, reaching out to touch the illusion. Her finger passed through it, causing ripples like a stone dropped in a pond. Isn't it amazing? Maggie gushed, her eyes wide with wonder. Jasper, you've outdone yourself. Jasper preened a bit at the praise. Wait until you see what happens when we start playing. Everyone, choose your character token. Four exquisitely detailed figurines appeared on the board. Paige selected a wise-looking librarian, of course, Elliot chose a flamboyant wizard, Maggie picked a fierce warrior princess, and Jasper settled on a roguish bard. As soon as they placed their tokens on the starting space, Paige felt a strange tingling sensation. She gasped as her clothes transformed, shimmering and changing until she found herself wearing the robes of her character token. What just happened? She asked, examining her new outfit with a mixture of alarm and fascination. Elliot, now resplendent in colorful wizard's robes, grinned. The game is bringing our characters to life. Don't worry, it's just an illusion. Though I must say, you look rather fetching as a magical librarian. Maggie, who was admiring her warrior princess armor, giggled. This is so cool. Okay, who goes first? Jasper rolled an ornate die, which floated in the air before landing on the board. Looks like it's Paige's turn to start our adventure. Paige took a deep breath and moved her token. As soon as it landed, the room around them shimmered and changed. Suddenly, they found themselves standing in a lush forest glade, the game board now a pedestal in the center. Welcome, adventurers, a disembodied voice boomed. Your quest begins now. Seek the crystal of wisdom hidden in the depths of the whispering woods. But beware, for the path is fraught with peril and riddled with puzzles. Paige couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, standing in a magical forest in her living room, about to embark on a fantastical quest with her friends. A few months ago, this would have sent her running for the hills. Now, she found herself excited by the prospect. Well, she said, adjusting her magical librarian spectacles, I suppose we'd better start looking for clues. Any ideas, oh wise wizard? She turned to Elliot with a playful smirk. Elliot stroked his suddenly present beard thoughtfully. I suggest we consult the ancient texts. Surely a librarian of your caliber can decipher their secrets. As if on cue, a book materialized in Paige's hands. She opened it, and glowing words floated off the page, forming a riddle in the air. Through branches thick and shadows deep, where silent guardians their vigil keep, seek the path that moonlight shows, to find the crystal's hidden glows. Oh, a riddle! Maggie exclaimed, bouncing on her toes, her warrior princess armor clanking. I love riddles. Although I'm usually better at smashing things. Jasper strummed his magical lute, which had appeared out of nowhere. Perhaps a song will help us think? He began to play a jaunty tune, and to everyone's amusement, the trees around them started swaying in time to the music. As they debated the meaning of the riddle, the forest around them came alive with magical creatures. A group of pixies fluttered by, giggling and tossing glittery dust in their wake. A wise old owl perched on a nearby branch, offering cryptic advice in rhyme. Paige found herself thoroughly enjoying the experience. She laughed as Elliot attempted to cast spells with his new wizard powers, resulting in a shower of multicolored sparks that turned Jasper's hair a vibrant purple. She cheered when Maggie used her warrior's strength to move a boulder, revealing a hidden path. Their first challenge came in the form of a mischievous group of forest sprites who demanded a dance-off in exchange for passage through their territory. Jasper's bard skills came in handy as he played a lively tune, while the others attempted to keep up with the sprites' impossible moves. Paige surprised everyone, including herself, with a particularly graceful twirl that had the sprites cheering. Who knew our librarian had such moves? Elliot teased, slightly out of breath from his own attempts at magical dancing. Paige grinned, her cheeks flushed with exertion and excitement. There's a lot you don't know about me, Mr. Wizard. I contain multitudes. As they progressed deeper into the forest, the challenges became more complex. They encountered a bridge guarded by a troll who insisted on a battle of wits. Paige's quick thinking and vast knowledge from years of reading came to the forefront as she engaged the troll in a rapid-fire round of riddles and trivia. What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows, the troll growled. Without missing a beat, Paige replied, a mountain. The troll's eyes widened in surprise. Correct. But can you tell me what building has the most stories? Paige smirked. That's easy. A library, of course. As the troll grudgingly allowed them to pass, Maggie whooped with delight. That was amazing, Paige. You showed that troll who's boss. Elliot squeezed Paige's hand, his eyes shining with pride. I always knew you were brilliant, but seeing you in action like this, it's something else entirely. Their next obstacle was a maze of mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of reality. Elliot's magical abilities were put to the test as he tried to discern the true path from the illusions. It's all about perspective, he mused, waving his wand in intricate patterns. We need to look beyond what our eyes are telling us. As they navigated the maze, Paige found herself reflecting on how much she'd changed since meeting Elliot. The woman who once found comfort in the predictable routine of her library now reveled in the joy of the unexpected. She watched as Elliot confidently led them through the maze, his magic intertwining with the game's enchantments, and felt a surge of affection. Finally, they emerged from the maze into a moonlit clearing. At its center stood an ancient tree, its branches reaching towards the stars. Nestled in its roots was a glowing crystal. The crystal of wisdom, Jasper breathed. We've found it. But as they approached, the tree's branches came to life, forming a protective barrier around the crystal. A deep, rumbling voice emanated from the trunk. Only the purest of heart and the wisest of minds may claim the crystal, it intoned. Prove your worth, adventurers. What followed was a series, as they said their goodbyes and headed home, walking hand in hand under the starlit sky, Paige felt a sense of excitement for what the future might hold. The fundraiser was approaching, bringing with it new challenges and opportunities for magical mishaps. But with Elliot by her side and her newfound appreciation for the unexpected, she knew they could handle anything. You know, Paige said as they neared her apartment, I think I have some new ideas for the fundraiser. What if we incorporated elements from tonight's game? A magical scavenger hunt through the library, with books coming to life and riddles to solve. Elliot grinned, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. That sounds brilliant. We could create different themed areas, like we did in the game. A fantasy section with magical creatures, a mystery corner with puzzles to solve. As they continued to brainstorm, their excitement building, either noticed the faint glow emanating from Paige's bag where she tucked away a souvenir from the game, a small, seemingly ordinary book that was anything but. Little did they know, their magical game night was about to spill over into reality in ways they never could have imagined. The line between fantasy and reality was blurring, and their biggest adventure was just beginning. The next morning, as Paige prepared for another day at the library, she felt a lingering sense of the previous night's magic. She couldn't wait to start implementing their new ideas for the fundraiser. As she reached for her favorite book to take with her, she paused, her hand hovering over the small game souvenir instead. Why not, she thought, slipping it into her bag. A little magic might be just what the library needs today. Chapter 14, Kitchen Chaos. The success of the game night had left Paige and Elliot riding high on a wave of magical enthusiasm. As they brainstormed more ideas for the upcoming library fundraiser, Elliot suggested they take a cooking class together. It'll be fun, he said, and who knows? We might pick up some ideas for magical refreshments for the event. Paige, still buzzing from their recent adventures, agreed readily. Why not? As long as you promise not to turn the chef into a frog or something. The cooking class was held in a charming little culinary school downtown. As they entered the warmly lit kitchen, the air rich with the scent of herbs and spices, Paige felt a flutter of excitement. This was exactly the kind of normal, couple-Y activity she'd always imagined doing with a partner. Welcome, everyone. The instructor, a jovial man named Chef Antonio, greeted the class. Today, we'll be making a classic Italian feast. Let's start with the basics, chopping vegetables for our sauce. Paige and Elliot took their places at a workstation, donning aprons and picking up their knives. As Chef Antonio demonstrated the proper technique for dicing an onion, Elliot leaned close to Paige. Watch this, he whispered, a mischievous glint in his eye. With a subtle wave of his hand, his knife began to move on its own, perfectly dicing the onion in seconds. Elliot. Paige hissed, torn between amusement and alarm. We're supposed to be doing this ourselves. Just having a bit of fun, Elliot grinned. Come on, give it a try. Just focus on what you want the knife to do. Paige hesitated, then concentrated on her knife. To her surprise, it twitched slightly, then began to chop her tomatoes, albeit a bit more erratically than Elliot's had. I'm doing it, she whispered excitedly, watching in wonder as the knife danced across the cutting board. Their magical chopping went unnoticed by the rest of the class, and Paige found herself enjoying the subtle use of magic. It felt like a secret shared between them, a little bubble of enchantment in the ordinary world. As they moved on to preparing the pasta dough, Elliot decided to take things up a notch. With a flick of his wrist, the flour began to measure itself out, floating through the air in a graceful arc to land in their mixing bowl. Paige giggled, getting into the spirit of things. She focused on the eggs, willing them to crack themselves and drop neatly into the bowl. One egg, however, seemed to have other ideas. It zoomed past the bowl, ricocheting off the wall and rolling across the counter. Oops, Paige muttered, chasing after the runaway egg. Their antics caught the attention of Chef Antonio, who raised an eyebrow at their progress. Well, he said, eyeing their perfectly measured ingredients. You two seem to have quite the knack for this. Keep up the good work. Encouraged by their success, and the chef's obliviousness, Paige and Elliot grew bolder with their magical assistance. The pasta machine cranked itself, rolling out perfect sheets of dough. Vegetables diced themselves in midair before falling neatly into the simmering sauce. Paige even managed to levitate a pinch of salt, sprinkling it into the pot with a graceful gesture. However, as they should have learned by now, magic had a way of taking on a life of its own when left unchecked. It started small at first. A wooden spoon that continued stirring even after Elliot had let go of it. A whisk that whirred a bit too enthusiastically, sending droplets of sauce flying. But soon, the entire kitchen seemed to come alive with magical energy. Pots and pans began to dance across the stovetop, jockeying for position over the burners. The refrigerator door swung open of its own accord, ingredients floating out to join the cooking frenzy. Even the sink got in on the act, its faucet twisting into improbable shapes as it sprayed water in artistic arcs. Elliot, Paige said, her voice a mix of awe and alarm, I think we might have overdone it a bit. Before Elliot could respond, a battle cry rang out across the kitchen. They turned to see a squadron of spatulas and ladles rising into the air, led by a particularly fierce-looking meat tenderizer. Take cover. Elliot yelled, pulling Paige down behind their workstation just as the utensils launched their attack. Chaos erupted in the kitchen. Other students screamed and ducked as cooking implements whizzed through the air. Chef Antonio stood in the middle of it all, his mouth agape, as a procession of rolling pins marched past him in perfect formation. "We have to do something," Paige shouted over the din, ducking as a colander helmet flew over her head. Elliot nodded, his face set in determination. "On 3, we'll make a break for the pantry. Ready? 1, 2, 3. They dashed across the kitchen, dodging flying cutlery and weaving through a rain of flour that had begun falling from the ceiling. They reached the pantry just as a brigade of whisks charged past, their wires vibrating menacingly. Safe for the moment, Paige turned to Elliot, unable to suppress a giggle despite the mayhem. "I can't believe this is happening. What do we do now?" Elliot ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of flour. "We need to cast a counter spell, something to calm everything down. But it'll take both of us. Are you up for it?" Paige took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. A year ago, she would have been paralyzed with fear in this situation. But now, standing next to Elliot in a pantry while sentient kitchen utensils waged war outside, she felt nothing but exhilarated. "Let's do this," she said firmly. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the pantry. The scene that greeted them was one of utter culinary bedlam. A troupe of forks was performing an elaborate can-can on the counter. The stovetop had transformed into a bubbling, multicolored cauldron. And in the center of it all, Chef Antonio sat in a daze, wearing a colander on his head while a gentle rain of Parmesan cheese fell around him. Paige and Elliot raised their free hands, focusing all their energy on reversing the magical chaos. Paige thought of the calm, orderly kitchen they had walked into, while Elliot concentrated on unraveling the wild magic that had taken hold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the madness began to subside. Utensils dropped from the air, clattering harmlessly to the floor. The stove returned to normal, pots settling back into place. The rain of cheese sputtered and stopped. As the last of the magic dissipated, leaving the kitchen in disarray but no longer sentient, Paige and Elliot looked at each other and burst into laughter. "Did you see the conga line of corkscrews?" Paige gasped between giggles. "What about the mop that was trying to tango with Chef Antonio?" Elliot countered, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. Their laughter was infectious, and soon the entire class joined in, the absurdity of the situation finally hitting them. Even Chef Antonio, removing the colander from his head, couldn't help but chuckle. "In all my years of teaching," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "I've never seen anything quite like that. I don't know how you did it, but that was certainly an unforgettable lesson in culinary creativity." As they helped clean up the kitchen, Paige marveled at how much her life had changed. A year ago, a magical mishap of this magnitude would have sent her into a panic. Now, she found herself relishing the unexpected adventure, her sides aching from laughter rather than stress. "You know," she said to Elliot as they scrubbed flour off the ceiling, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually glad things got a little out of hand. It was fun, in a completely chaotic way." Elliot beamed at her, his eyes twinkling. "That's my girl. Embracing the chaos like a true magical apprentice." Paige flicked some soap suds at him playfully. "Don't get too cocky, Mr. Wizard. I seem to recall it was your magical meddling that started this whole thing." "But it was our magic together that fixed it," Elliot countered, pulling her close for a sudsy kiss. As they continued to clean, Paige couldn't help but reflect on their journey together. She thought about the first time she'd encountered Elliot's magic, how overwhelmed and frightened she'd been. Now, here she was, casting spells and battling sentient kitchenware like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Elliot," she said, pausing in her scrubbing, "do you ever worry that we're relying too much on magic? That we're losing touch with the normal world?" Elliot considered this for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. I don't think so, he said finally. If anything, I think magic has helped us appreciate the ordinary more. Look at tonight, we came to learn about cooking, and we did. We just added our own special flair to it. Paige laughed, nodding as they continued to brainstorm, bouncing ideas off each other with growing enthusiasm. Paige realized how seamlessly their worlds had blended. Her love of books and organization meshed perfectly with Elliot's magical creativity, creating something unique and wonderful. They reached Paige's apartment, but neither seemed eager to say goodnight. The energy between them crackled with possibility and shared excitement. Want to come in and work on the fundraiser plan some more? Paige asked impulsively. Elliot's smile was answer enough. As they entered her apartment, already deep in discussion about how to magically enhance a literary-themed menu, Paige felt a sense of contentment wash over her. This was what she'd been missing all along, not just the magic and excitement, but the joy of sharing her passions with someone who understood. The library fundraiser was shaping up to be unlike anything Stardust had ever seen. And as Paige and Elliot sat side by side, mapping out their plans late into the night, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together, with magic, creativity, and plenty of laughter. As the clock struck midnight, Paige yawned, stretching her arms above her head. I can't believe how late it is. We should probably call it a night. Elliot nodded, stifling a yawn of his own. You're right. But this has been amazing, Paige. I love how your mind works, how you can take my crazy magical ideas and turn them into something real and wonderful. Paige felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. And I love how you push me out of my comfort zone, how you make me see the magic in everyday things. We make a good team, don't we? The best, Elliot agreed, leaning in for a soft kiss. As they parted, a mischievous glint appeared in Elliot's eye. You know, I could magic us up some midnight snacks. Promise I won't let the kitchen utensils stage another revolt. Paige laughed, shaking her head fondly. I think we've had enough magical cooking for one day. How about we just make some good old-fashioned non-magical popcorn instead? Deal, Elliot grinned. But I can't promise not to levitate a few kernels. For practice, you understand. As they moved to the kitchen, playfully debating the merits of magical versus mundane popcorn preparation, Paige felt a surge of happiness. This was her life now, a perfect blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary, filled with love, laughter, and just the right amount of magical mischief. While Elliot set about making the popcorn, with only minimal magical interference, Paige found herself drawn to the window. The night sky was clear, stars twinkling brightly above the sleepy town of Stardust. She thought about how much had changed since Elliot had come into her life, how the ordinary world she'd known had been transformed into something magical and wonderful. Penny for your thoughts? Elliot's voice came from behind her, accompanied by the warm, buttery smell of freshly popped corn. Paige turned, smiling as she accepted the bowl he offered. I was just thinking about how different my life is now, compared to a year ago. If someone had told me then that I'd be spending my evenings battling enchanted kitchen utensils and planning magical fundraisers, I would have thought they were crazy. Elliot chuckled, wrapping an arm around her waist. And now? Now, Paige said, leaning into him, I can't imagine my life any other way. You've shown me a whole new world, Elliot, and I love every magical, chaotic moment of it. They stood there for a while, munching on popcorn and gazing out at the starry sky. As they watched, a shooting star blazed across the heavens. Make a wish, Elliot whispered. Paige closed her eyes, but found she didn't know what to wish for. She had everything she could want right here: love, magic, adventure. Instead, she simply sent a silent thank you to the universe for bringing Elliot into her life. When she opened her eyes, she found Elliot watching her with a soft smile. What did you wish for? He asked. If I tell you, it won't come true, Paige teased. Elliot's smile widened. Fair enough. But whatever it is, I hope it involves me. Always, Paige assured him, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of butter and magic. As they cleaned up the last of the popcorn kernels, Paige's mind drifted to their plans for the upcoming fundraiser. You know, she said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about adding a special element to the event. What if we created a magical book that visitors could actually step into? Elliot's eyes lit up with excitement. That's brilliant. We could use illusion magic to create different literary worlds for people to explore. But it would take some pretty advanced spell work. Well, Paige said with a mischievous smile, I guess that means we'll need to practice. How about a magic lesson tomorrow? Something a bit more controlled than our kitchen adventure. Elliot grinned, pulling her close. It's a date. Meet me at the park after work? As Paige nodded, she felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Tomorrow's lesson would be another step into the magical world she was growing to love. Chapter 15, A Storm of Love. Paige stood outside Elliot's apartment door, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. In her hands, she clutched a small, leather-bound spell book she had borrowed from Elliot's collection during their last study session. Tonight, she was going to surprise him with a magical evening of her own creation. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. As Elliot's footsteps approached, she quickly whispered the incantation she'd been practicing all day. The hallway lights flickered momentarily, and she felt a surge of magical energy course through her. Elliot opened the door, his face lighting up at the sight of her. Paige. I wasn't expecting you tonight. What a lovely surprises. His words were cut short as he took in the scene before him. Floating just above Paige's outstretched hands was a miniature galaxy, stars twinkling and planets slowly rotating in a mesmerizing dance. Tada! Paige exclaimed, grinning proudly. I thought I'd bring the universe to you tonight. Elliot's eyes widened in amazement. Paige, this is incredible. Did you do this all by yourself? Paige nodded, carefully guiding the tiny galaxy into the apartment. I've been practicing. I wanted to show you that I'm taking this magic thing seriously. As they stepped inside, however, things began to go slightly awry. The miniature galaxy started to expand, growing larger and larger until it filled the entire living room. Stars whizzed past their heads, and a small meteor shower rained down on Elliot's coffee table. Oops, Paige muttered, frantically flipping through the spellbook. This wasn't supposed to happen. How do I make it stop? Elliot, far from being upset, was laughing in delight. This is amazing, Paige. Look, there's Saturn. He pointed to a ringed planet that was now orbiting his reading lamp. Paige couldn't help but giggle at his enthusiasm, even as she tried to regain control of the spell. She waved her hands, attempting to shrink the galaxy back to its original size. Instead, the celestial bodies began to swirl faster, creating a cosmic whirlpool in the middle of the room. Uh-oh, Elliot said, still grinning. I think we might be creating a black hole in my living room. As if on cue, the swirling vortex began to suck in small objects. Magazines flew off the coffee table, and a pair of Elliot's socks zoomed past their heads into the miniature void. Quick! Paige shouted over the whooshing sound of the cosmic wind. Help me close it. Together, they focused their magic on containing the spiraling galaxy. Slowly, the vortex began to shrink, the planets and stars condensing back into a more manageable size. Just as they thought they had it under control, there was a loud pop, and the entire magical construct vanished. For a moment, they stood in silence, staring at the now ordinary living room. Then, a single rain cloud materialized overhead, promptly dumping a torrent of water on their heads. Paige stood there, soaked and speechless, while Elliot blinked water out of his eyes. Then, simultaneously, they burst into laughter. Well, Elliot chuckled, wringing water out of his shirt, I'd say that was a stellar performance. Paige groaned at the pun, but couldn't stop giggling. I'm so sorry, Elliot. I really thought I had it this time. Are you kidding? Elliot grinned, pulling her into a wet hug. This is the most fun I've had all week. Although, he added, looking up at the rain cloud that was still happily showering them, we should probably do something about our indoor weather system. They spent the next hour attempting to dispel the rain cloud, which seemed determined to stay put. Their efforts led to a series of increasingly comical situations. At one point, Paige's spell turned the rain into jelly beans, which bounced off their heads and covered the floor in a rainbow of candy. Elliot's attempt to evaporate the cloud resulted in it snowing inside the apartment, turning the living room into a winter wonderland. They made a tiny snowman on the coffee table before trying again to get rid of the magical precipitation. Finally, after Paige accidentally turned the cloud into a flock of rubber ducks, which proceeded to quack Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, they managed to vanish the entire meteorological menagerie. Exhausted but still chuckling, they collapsed onto Elliot's sofa, which squelched unpleasantly beneath them. So, Paige said, picking a jelly bean out of her hair, not quite the romantic evening I had planned. Elliot turned to her, his eyes shining with affection and mirth. Paige, this was perfect. Do you know why? She shook her head, curious. Because it was utterly, wonderfully you, he said softly. You wanted to do something special for me, so you taught yourself a complex spell. And when it went sideways, you didn't give up. You laughed, you problem-solved, and you turned a potential disaster into an adventure. Paige felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with magic. You're not upset that I flooded your apartment and nearly created a black hole in your living room? Elliot laughed, pulling her close. Are you kidding? This is going down as one of the best nights ever. Besides, he added with a wink, I needed to redecorate anyway. As they sat there, damp and surrounded by the aftermath of Paige's magical misadventure, she marveled at how far she'd come. The Paige of a year ago would have been mortified by such a failure. But now, she found herself already planning her next magical surprise, undaunted by this evening's chaos. You know, she said thoughtfully, I think I see where I went wrong with the spell. If I adjust the incantation slightly and focus more on containing the energy. Elliot's eyes widened in mock horror. Maybe we should save the next experiment for somewhere with less breakable objects. Like, say, the middle of a desert? Paige laughed, swatting him playfully. Oh, come on. Where's your sense of adventure? Currently hiding under the couch with a rubber duck, Elliot retorted, but his eyes were twinkling. How about we dry off and order some pizza? I think we've had enough excitement for one night. As they set about cleaning up the apartment, occasionally pausing to marvel at an overlooked jelly bean or a stray snowflake, Paige felt a deep sense of contentment. This wasn't the perfect, romantic evening she'd envisioned, but somehow, it was better. It was real, it was them, and it was magical in its own chaotic way. Later, as they sat on the newly dried couch, sharing a pizza and recounting their favorite moments from the evening's adventure, Paige realized something important. Magic, like love, wasn't about perfection. It was about taking risks, embracing the unexpected, and finding joy in the journey. Elliot, she said, setting down her slice of pizza, thank you for tonight. For laughing with me, not at me. For making me feel like I can do anything, even when I'm messing up spectacularly. Elliot smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. As he did, a tiny star appeared, twinkling briefly before fading away. That's what love is all about, isn't it? Being there for each other, through the storms and the starlight. Paige leaned in, kissing him softly. As their lips met, she felt that familiar tingle of magic, but this time, it came from within her. Not from any spell or enchantment, but from the pure, unadulterated joy of being with someone who accepted her, chaos and all. As they parted, Paige couldn't help but laugh as she noticed a small rain cloud had formed above their heads, sprinkling them with a light drizzle. Oops, she giggled. I guess I still need some practice. Elliot grinned, pulling her close. Well then, I guess we'll just have to keep practicing together. After all, we've got all the time in the world. As they snuggled on the couch, the tiny rain cloud providing a romantic backdrop, Paige felt a surge of excitement for the future. There would be more spells to learn, more magical mishaps to navigate, and undoubtedly more chaos to embrace. But with Elliot by her side, she was ready for it all. The next morning, Paige woke up feeling refreshed and inspired. She had fallen asleep on Elliot's couch, lulled by the soft patter of their personal rain cloud, which had thankfully dissipated overnight. As she stretched and yawned, she noticed Elliot in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast without magic. "Good morning, sunshine," he called out, flipping a slightly burnt pancake. "I thought I'd try my hand at some non-magical cooking for a change." Paige smiled, padding over to the kitchen. "It smells wonderful," she said, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "But you know, a little magical assistance wouldn't hurt. Maybe just to prevent those pancakes from becoming charcoal?" As she walked home, Paige's mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming fundraiser. She was determined to make it a success, to prove to herself and to Elliot that she could handle the responsibility of magic. Little did she know, this determination would set in motion a chain of events that would test their relationship in ways they never expected. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Paige threw herself into finalizing the details for the fundraiser, working late into the night at the library. Elliot helped when he could, but he seemed distracted, often lost in thought. On the evening before the big event, Paige was putting the finishing touches on the magical book maze when Elliot burst into the library, his eyes shining with excitement. "Paige," he exclaimed, slightly out of breath. "I've had an idea. Something to make tomorrow night truly unforgettable." Paige looked up from her work, raising an eyebrow. "Oh? What did you have in mind?" Elliot grinned, pulling her close. "It's a surprise. But trust me, it's going to be spectacular. A magical display that will light up the whole town in your honor." Paige felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "That sounds wonderful, Elliot, but are you sure it's a good idea? We've already got so much planned." "Don't worry," Elliot assured her, kissing her forehead. "I've got it all under control. This is going to be the most magical night Stardust has ever seen." As Elliot left, practically bouncing with enthusiasm, Paige couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She trusted Elliot, of course, but his grand gestures had a tendency to be unpredictable. Shaking off her concerns, Paige returned to her work. Tomorrow was going to be a big day, and she needed to be ready. As she put the final enchantments in place, she allowed herself a moment of pride. Despite her initial doubts, she had come so far in her magical abilities. Tomorrow, she would show everyone, including Elliot, just how much she had learned. Chapter 16, Lights Out. The day of the library fundraiser dawned bright and clear, filled with promise. Paige arrived at the library early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. As she unlocked the doors, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the magical evening ahead. Throughout the day, volunteers bustled about, setting up booths and decorations. Paige oversaw it all, her clipboard in hand, checking and double-checking every detail. The magical book maze was coming together beautifully, its shelves whispering enticing snippets of stories to passers-by. The potion-making station for kids was stocked with colorful, harmless ingredients that fizzed and sparked when mixed. As evening approached, Paige found herself growing increasingly anxious. Elliot hadn't arrived yet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Just as she was about to call him, he burst through the library doors, his hair wild and his eyes bright with a manic energy. "Elliot!" Paige exclaimed, relief washing over her. "Where have you been? The event starts in an hour." Sorry, he said, pulling her into a quick hug. "I've been working on your surprise. It's going to be amazing, Paige. You'll see." Before she could question him further, he was off, darting between the bookshelves with an armful of mysterious magical implements. Paige wanted to follow him, to make sure whatever he was planning wouldn't interfere with the carefully orchestrated event, but a volunteer called her attention to a last-minute issue with the refreshments. As the first guests began to arrive, Paige pushed her concerns aside, focusing on welcoming everyone and ensuring the evening ran smoothly. The library was soon filled with the sounds of laughter and excitement as children and adults alike explored the magical attractions. Paige was in the middle of explaining the rules of the Guess the Spell contest when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Elliot, his eyes shining with barely contained excitement. "It's time," he whispered. "Come outside. I want everyone to see this." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Paige followed him out of the library, the crowd trailing behind them. As they stepped into the cool night air, Elliot raised his hands dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice magically amplified, "prepare to witness a display of magic unlike anything you've ever seen before. This is for you, Paige. A sky full of stars, just for you." With a grand gesture, Elliot began to cast his spell. At first, it was beautiful. The stars above seemed to brighten, swirling in mesmerizing patterns. Gasps of wonder rose from the crowd as constellations danced and shimmered. But then, something went wrong. The lights began to pulse, growing brighter and brighter. Paige squinted, raising a hand to shield her eyes. She could see Elliot's face, contorted in concentration, sweat beading on his brow as he struggled to control the magic. "Elliot," she called out, worry creeping into her voice. "Elliot, I think you should stop. Her words were cut off by a deafening boom. A blinding flash lit up the sky, and then, darkness. Complete and utter darkness fell over the town. The streetlights, the library, every house as far as the eye could see, all were plunged into blackness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, chaos erupted. People began to shout, children cried out in fear. In the darkness, Paige could hear the sound of things being knocked over, of people stumbling and colliding with each other. "Everyone, please remain calm," she called out, trying to keep her own panic at bay. "Stay where you are. We'll get the lights back on soon." But as minutes ticked by and the darkness persisted, Paige felt her confidence crumbling. This was supposed to be her moment, her chance to show everyone the beauty of magic. Instead, it had turned into a disaster. She found Elliot in the dark, guided by the sound of his labored breathing. "What happened?" she hissed, anger and disappointment warring in her voice. I don't know," Elliot stammered. "The spell, it was more powerful than I anticipated. I thought I could control it, but you couldn't," Paige finished for him, her tone flat. "Elliot, I told you we needed to be careful. This event was important to me, to the library. And now." She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the darkness around them, though she knew he couldn't see it. The sounds of confusion and fear from the townsfolk filled the air, a stark reminder of the consequences of their magical meddling. As emergency services arrived and people began to disperse, Paige and Elliot worked silently to help where they could. The joy and wonder of the evening had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive atmosphere of disappointment and recrimination. It wasn't until hours later, when the immediate crisis had passed and a semblance of order had been restored, that Paige and Elliot finally faced each other. "Paige, I'm so sorry," Elliot began, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted to do something special for you, to show everyone how amazing magic can be." Paige felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I know you didn't mean for this to happen, Elliot. But it did. And now I don't know if I can do this anymore." Elliot's face fell, fear flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," Paige gestured between them. "Us. The magic. It's all so unpredictable, so chaotic. I thought I could handle it, that I could find a balance between my world and yours. But after tonight—" "Paige, please," Elliot pleaded, reaching for her hand. "We can fix this. I'll be more careful, I promise." We can find a way to make it work. But Paige stepped back, shaking her head. I need time, Elliot. Time to think, to figure out if this is really what I want. If our worlds were ever truly meant to merge. The look of devastation on Elliot's face nearly broke her resolve, but Paige stood firm. With a final, tearful glance, she turned and walked away, leaving Elliot standing alone in the darkened street. As she made her way home, the weight of the evening's events pressing down on her, Paige couldn't help but question everything. Had she been foolish to think she could ever truly be a part of Elliot's magical world? Was love enough to bridge the gap between order and chaos? With each step, the distance between her and Elliot seemed to grow, not just physically but emotionally. The magic that had once brought them together now stood as a barrier, a reminder of how different their worlds really were. As Paige reached her apartment, she paused at the door, looking back at the still darkened town. Somewhere out there, Elliot was grappling with his own doubts and fears. The weight of their argument, the disaster at the fundraiser, and the uncertainty of their future together pressed heavily on her heart. With a deep sigh, Paige entered her apartment, the familiar surroundings now feeling strangely empty without the promise of magic and Elliot's presence. As she sank onto her couch, exhaustion and emotion finally overtaking her, she couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the end? Or was there a way to reconcile her orderly world with the chaos of magic? Chapter 17, Reflections and Revelations. The days following the disastrous fundraiser passed in a blur for Paige. She threw herself into her work at the library, methodically reorganizing shelves and cataloging new arrivals, finding comfort in the familiar routines. But even as she immersed herself in the orderly world of books, she couldn't escape the nagging sense that something was missing. Each time the library door opened, her heart would skip a beat, half expecting to see Elliot's familiar grin. But he never came, and Paige was left to grapple with the conflicting emotions that churned within her. One quiet afternoon, as she was reshelving books in the fantasy section, Paige found herself pausing at a familiar title. It was the first book she and Elliot had bonded over, a whimsical tale of a librarian who discovers she can bring stories to life. With trembling hands, she opened the cover, and a small note fluttered out. To my favorite librarian, it read in Elliot's messy scrawl. May your life always be filled with magic, both on and off the page. Paige felt tears prick at her eyes as she remembered the day he'd given her the note, how excited she'd been to explore this new magical world with him. When had that excitement turned to fear? When had she started seeing magic as a threat rather than a wonder? Across town, Elliot was facing his own inner turmoil. He'd secluded himself in his apartment, surrounded by spell books and magical artifacts, desperately trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong. The walls were covered in scribbled notes and diagrams, failed attempts to recreate the spell that had caused the blackout. But no matter how hard he tried, Elliot couldn't focus. His mind kept wandering to Paige, to the look of disappointment and fear in her eyes that night. He'd always seen his magic as a gift, something that made him special. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that it might be pushing away the person he cared about most. As the days turned into weeks, both Paige and Elliot found themselves going through the motions of their daily lives, each acutely aware of the other's absence. They'd become such a part of each other's routines that even the smallest tasks now felt incomplete. Paige would catch herself turning to share a funny anecdote from her day, only to remember that Elliot wasn't there. Elliot would absent-mindedly conjure 2 cups of coffee in the morning, the second one growing cold on the counter as he stared at it wistfully. It was during this period of separation that Paige began to notice things she'd overlooked before. The way the sunlight created patterns on her bedroom wall in the morning, almost like a magical light show. The small acts of kindness she witnessed daily in the library, a child helping another reach a high shelf, an elderly patron offering to return books for a busy mother. These moments of everyday magic had always been there, she realized. She'd just been too focused on the grand, flashy displays to notice. One particularly challenging day, Paige found herself at Beanstalk Bistro, seeking comfort in a familiar setting. As she approached the counter, lost in thought, she didn't notice the faint shimmer in the air around her usual table. "The usual, dear?" Abigail asked, her kind eyes twinkling with something that might have been concern or mischief. Paige nodded distractedly, making her way to her favorite spot. As she sat down, she felt a strange tingling sensation. Suddenly, her chair began to float, lifting her gently into the air. "Oh!" Paige exclaimed, grabbing the edges of the table, which had also started to levitate. Around her, other patrons gasped and pointed, some laughing in delight at the unexpected show. As she floated there, suspended in midair with her coffee cup bobbing beside her, Paige couldn't help but laugh. It was exactly the kind of whimsical, harmless magic that Elliot loved to perform. And despite her initial shock, she found herself enjoying the experience. "Having fun up there?" Abigail called out, a knowing smile on her face. Paige grinned back, surprising herself with her lack of panic. "You know, I think I am." As she floated back down to the ground, Paige noticed a small card tucked under her saucer. In Elliot's handwriting, it read, "For when you need a little lift. I hope it brings a smile to your face, even if I'm not there to see it." The note brought a fresh wave of emotion. Elliot had left this spell for her, knowing she might need a bit of magic in her life even when they were apart. It was thoughtful, sweet, and just a little bit mischievous, everything she loved about him. This incident at the bistro became a turning point for Paige. As she walked home that evening, she found herself noticing the magic in the everyday world around her. The way the leaves danced in the wind, the intricate patterns of frost on windows, the warm glow of lights in cozy homes. These were all kinds of magic, she realized, just as valid and beautiful as any spell Elliot could cast. Meanwhile, Elliot was going through his own transformation. Without Paige to impress or magical problems to solve, he found himself at loose ends. On a whim, he decided to try painting, without magic. His first attempts were disastrous, paint-splattered messes that bore little resemblance to what he'd intended. But as he persevered, Elliot found a different kind of magic in the act of creation. The way colors blended on the canvas, the satisfaction of bringing an image to life with nothing but his hands and his imagination, it was exhilarating in a way that was entirely different from casting spells. One afternoon, as he was wrestling with a particularly stubborn landscape, Elliot had a revelation. He'd been relying on magic as a crutch, using it for shortcuts and quick fixes instead of putting in the hard work to truly master something. It was easier to wave a wand and make something happen than to face the possibility of failure. This realization led Elliot to reflect on his relationship with Paige. Had he been using grand magical gestures as a substitute for genuine emotional connection? Was he so afraid of not being enough on his own that he constantly felt the need to prove his worth through magic? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Elliot found himself walking through the park where he and Paige had shared so many magical moments. Without thinking, he raised his hand to conjure a small light show, a habit he'd developed to cheer himself up. But this time, he stopped himself. Instead, he sat on a bench and simply observed the world around him. The play of light through the leaves, the laughter of children on the playground, the gentle rustling of the wind, it was all magical in its own way, he realized. And it was all happening without any intervention from him. For the first time, Elliot began to understand what Paige had been trying to tell him all along. Magic wasn't just about grand gestures and spectacular displays. It was in the small moments, the quiet connections, the simple joys of everyday life. As the weeks went by, both Paige and Elliot found themselves growing and changing in ways they hadn't expected. Paige began to embrace spontaneity, allowing herself to find joy in unexpected moments. She even tried her hand at a few simple spells, laughing at her mistakes instead of getting frustrated. One day, while reorganizing the children's section, Paige decided to add a little magic to story time. With a wave of her hand and a whispered incantation, she made the illustrations in the book she was reading come to life, floating above the pages. The children's eyes widened in wonder, and their delighted giggles filled the air. In that moment, Paige felt a rush of joy that rivaled any she'd experienced with Elliot's grand magical displays. Elliot, on the other hand, learned to appreciate the magic of the mundane. He started volunteering at a local community center, teaching art to kids. The joy on their faces when they created something beautiful was, he realized, just as magical as any spell he could cast. During one of his classes, a young girl was struggling with her painting, frustrated tears welling in her eyes. Elliot's first instinct was to use magic to fix it, to make her smile. But instead, he sat down beside her, gently guiding her hand, showing her how to blend the colors to create the effect she wanted. The look of pride and accomplishment on her face when she finished was more rewarding than any magical feat Elliot had ever performed. Despite these personal growths, neither Paige nor Elliot could quite bring themselves to reach out to the other. The memory of their argument, the fear of rejection, and the uncertainty of whether they could truly bridge the gap between their worlds held them back. It was Maggie who finally intervened. Fed up with watching her best friend mope around, she cornered Paige one day at the library. "Okay, enough is enough," Maggie declared, hands on her hips. "You're miserable, Elliot's miserable, and frankly, the whole town is getting tired of the gloomy atmosphere. You two need to talk." Paige sighed, shelving a book with perhaps more force than necessary. "It's not that simple, Maggie. We want different things. Elliot needs magic like he needs air, and I don't know." Paige stood by the window of her apartment, watching the streetlights flicker to life. She thought about all the magical moments she'd experienced with Elliot, the laughter, the wonder, the joy of discovery. But she also thought about the quiet moments, the simple pleasures of sharing a cup of coffee or reading a book together. She realized that it was these moments, more than any grand magical gesture, that she missed the most. Across town, Elliot sat in his studio, surrounded by his non-magical creations. He looked at the paintings, each one a testament to the effort and patience he'd put into them. He thought about Paige, about her love for order and structure, and how it balanced his tendency towards chaos. He realized that it was her steady presence, her grounding influence, that had allowed him to truly flourish, both magically and personally. The answer, they both realized, couldn't be found in isolation. They needed to talk, to share their revelations and fears, to see if the love they still felt for each other was strong enough to overcome their differences. With trembling hands, Paige reached for her phone. At the same moment, across town, Elliot was doing the same. Their messages arrived simultaneously. "Can we talk?" As they both stared at their screens, hearts racing, the future hung in the balance. The next step would determine whether their story was one of love overcoming all obstacles, or a bittersweet tale of two worlds that could never quite align. But regardless of the outcome, both Paige and Elliot knew one thing for certain: they had changed. They had grown. And whatever happened next, they would face it with a new understanding of themselves, of each other, and of the true nature of magic in all its forms. Paige took a deep breath, her finger hovering over the reply button. She thought about all she had learned in the past weeks, about magic, about herself, about what truly mattered in life. With a surge of determination, she typed out her response: "Yes. Meet me at our spot in the park in an hour?" Across town, Elliot's phone buzzed with Paige's reply. A mix of relief and nervousness washed over him as he read her message. He glanced at his latest painting, a scene of the very park where they were about to meet. Without magic, he had captured the essence of the place, the way the light dappled through the leaves, the sense of peace and possibility. It was, he realized, a perfect representation of what he had learned during their time apart. Chapter 18, Love's Enchanted Garden. The enchanted garden of Stardust was silent in the fading light of dusk, its magical flowers closing their petals for the night. Paige walked along the familiar path, her heart pounding with each step. She hadn't planned to come here, her feet had simply led her to this place of memories and magic. As she rounded a bend, she stopped short. There, standing by the fountain where they had shared their first kiss, was Elliot. He seemed lost in thought, absently running his hand through the water, causing it to shimmer with faint, magical lights. For a moment, Paige considered turning back. They had agreed to meet at the park, not here. But before she could retreat, Elliot looked up and their eyes met. "Paige," he said softly, a mixture of surprise and hope in his voice. "Elliot," she replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to see you here." He gave a small, rueful smile. "Neither did I. I was just walking, and somehow ended up here. Funny how that happens, isn't it?" Paige nodded, taking a few hesitant steps closer. "It's like the garden wanted us to meet here." As she approached, a nearby rosebush suddenly burst into bloom, its flowers opening in a cascade of color and fragrance. Both Paige and Elliot jumped, startled by the sudden display, then looked at each other and burst into laughter. "Well," Elliot chuckled, "I guess some things never change. Magic still has a mind of its own around us." Paige's laughter softened into a warm smile. "Do you remember the first time we came here? When you tried to make the flowers dance for me?" Elliot groaned good-naturedly. "How could I forget? We ended up chasing that runaway bouquet all over the garden. I've never seen flowers move so fast." As they reminisced, the tension between them began to ease. They found themselves walking side by side along the garden paths, sharing memories of their magical misadventures. "Oh, and what about the time with the enchanted cookbook?" Paige giggled. "I've never seen spaghetti so determined to escape a pot." Elliot grinned, his eyes twinkling with mirth. "Or the great library reshelving disaster? I still can't believe we managed to convince your boss that a sudden gust of wind rearranged every book by color instead of the Dewey Decimal System." Their laughter echoed through the garden, seeming to bring it to life around them. Flowers turned to follow their progress, fairy lights twinkled in the trees, and the very air seemed to hum with magic and possibility. As they walked, Paige found herself noticing things she had overlooked before. The way the moonlight cast intricate shadows on the path, creating patterns that seemed to move and dance. The soft whisper of the wind through the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of magic and possibility. Even the earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a gentle, magical energy. Elliot, too, was seeing the garden with new eyes. He marveled at the subtle magic in the mundane, the perfect symmetry of a spider's web glistening with dew, the graceful arc of a fern unfurling its fronds, the synchronized blinking of fireflies in the deepening twilight. These were magics he had always taken for granted, too focused on grand gestures and spectacular spells to appreciate the everyday wonders around him. As they meandered through the garden, their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and shared glances. They spoke of the time apart, of the lessons learned and the growth experienced. Paige told Elliot about her attempts at small magics in the library, of the joy she found in bringing stories to life for the children during story time. "I finally understood what you meant about the wonder of magic," she admitted. Seeing their faces light up, it was like I was experiencing it all for the first time too. Elliot shared his experiences with non-magical painting, the frustration and ultimate satisfaction of creating something beautiful through sheer effort and persistence. "I realized that magic isn't just about spells and enchantments," he said. "It's about creation, about bringing something new into the world, whether that's through a wand or a paintbrush." As they talked, the garden seemed to respond to their emotions. When Paige spoke of her fears and doubts, the path darkened, shadows lengthening around them. But as she described her growing acceptance of magic in her life, flowers bloomed in her footsteps, their petals glowing softly in the dim light. When Elliot recounted his struggles with feeling inadequate without his magic, a cool mist settled around them, mirroring his melancholy. But as he spoke of his newfound appreciation for the magic of everyday life, the mist lifted, replaced by a warm, gentle breeze that carried the scent of sun-warmed earth and blooming flowers. As their mirth subsided, they found themselves back at the fountain. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle splashing of water. Paige, Elliot finally said, his voice soft but earnest. I owe you an apology. I've been so caught up in trying to impress you with grand magical gestures that I lost sight of what really matters. Magic isn't about big displays or solving every problem with a wave of a wand. It's about finding wonder in the everyday, about creating joy and beauty in small moments. You tried to show me that all along, and I was too blind to see it. Paige felt tears welling in her eyes. Oh, Elliot. I owe you an apology too. I was so afraid of chaos, of losing control, that I almost lost the best thing that ever happened to me. These past weeks have shown me that a little unpredictability, a little magic, can make life so much richer and more beautiful. I was so busy trying to maintain order that I almost missed out on the most wonderful adventure of all, loving you. Elliot reached out, gently taking her hands in his. So where do we go from here? He asked, hope and uncertainty mingling in his eyes. Paige squeezed his hands, a determined smile spreading across her face. Forward, together. If you're willing to give us another chance, I'd like to try again. Not as a librarian and a wizard, but as Paige and Elliot, two people who love each other and are ready to embrace all the magic life has to offer, big and small. Elliot's face lit up with joy. Nothing would make me happier, he said, pulling her close. As their lips met in a kiss, the garden around them erupted in magical celebration. Flowers bloomed in heart shapes, fairy lights danced in the air, and a gentle rain of glittering stardust fell around them. When they parted, both laughing in delight at the garden's enthusiastic response, Elliot raised an eyebrow. I swear that wasn't me this time, he said with a grin. Paige giggled, brushing some magical stardust from his hair. I believe you. I think the garden's just happy we figured things out. They sat on the edge of the fountain, hands intertwined, watching as the garden continued its joyful display. Paige leaned her head on Elliot's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace and rightness that she hadn't experienced in weeks. You know, she said softly, I think I finally understand what you've been trying to show me all along. Magic isn't just about spells and enchantments. It's about seeing the world with wonder, about finding joy in unexpected places. It's about love. Elliot nodded, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. And I've learned that the most powerful magic of all is the kind that brings people together, that creates connections and moments of beauty. You taught me that, Paige. Your love for books, for stories, for the little moments of everyday life, that's a kind of magic I never fully appreciated before. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as fireflies began to emerge, their soft light mingling with the fairy lights in the trees. The night was warm, filled with the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers and the gentle music of a nearby stream. So, Elliot said eventually, a hint of his old mischievous grin playing on his lips, what's our next adventure? Should we try to organize the most magical library fundraiser Stardust has ever seen? Paige laughed, the sound clear and joyful in the quiet garden. Maybe we should start with something a little smaller. How about a magical movie night at my place? We could enchant the popcorn to change flavors with each handful, or make the characters step out of the screen during particularly exciting scenes. Elliot's eyes lit up with excitement. That sounds perfect. And maybe we could invite Maggie and Jasper too? Make it a proper double date? Paige nodded enthusiastically. Yes. Oh, and we should stop by Beanstalk Bistro on the way. I've been practicing a little spell to make the cupcakes sing, and I've been dying to try it out. As they continued to plan, their excitement growing with each new idea, the garden around them seemed to hum with approval. Flowers swayed in a non-existent breeze, and the water in the fountain leapt higher. Together, they created magical floating lights that danced around the bistro, casting warm, ever-changing colors on the walls. Even Abigail got in on the fun, revealing a touch of magic of her own as she made the potted plants on the windowsill grow and shrink in time with the music playing softly in the background. As the night wore on, Paige and Elliot found themselves curled up in a cozy booth, surrounded by the gentle aftermath of their magical play. Abigail had bid them good night, telling them to lock up when they left and giving them one last knowing wink. "You know," Paige said, her voice soft with contentment, "I think this is what I missed most. Not the big spells or the grand gestures, but this. Just being together, creating little moments of magic and joy." Elliot nodded, pulling her closer. "I know what you mean. It's like we create our own kind of magic when we're together. Something that's more than just spells and potions." Paige smiled, leaning up to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "Exactly. It's a magic all our own, and I never want to lose it again." As they finally left the bistro, locking the door behind them with a promise to return soon, they stepped out into a world that seemed full of new possibilities. The stars twinkled brightly overhead, and a warm breeze carried the scent of night-blooming flowers. Paige and Elliot's journey was far from over. Chapter 19, A Love Beyond Magic. In the days following their reconciliation in the Enchanted Garden, Elliot found himself consumed by a singular thought: how to show Paige the depth of his love and commitment without relying on magic. He wanted to prove to her, and to himself, that their connection transcended spells and enchantments. After much contemplation, Elliot hatched a plan. It would require effort, planning, and more than a little help, but he was determined to make it perfect. For once, he would create magic without a single incantation or wave of a wand. Elliot began by reaching out to those closest to them. He called Maggie, explaining his idea and enlisting her help. Maggie, always a romantic at heart, was thrilled to be part of the plan. She suggested involving Jasper as well, knowing his organizational skills would be invaluable. Next, Elliot visited Abigail at Beanstalk Bistro. The wise old woman listened to his plan with a knowing smile, her eyes twinkling with approval. "It's about time," she said, patting his hand. "I'll close the bistro for the day. We'll need the space to prepare everything." With his team assembled, Elliot set to work. For days, he pored over his memories of his time with Paige, writing down every significant moment, every shared laugh, every tender exchange. Each memory was carefully transcribed onto a note card, his usually messy handwriting painstakingly neat. Meanwhile, Maggie and Jasper scoured the town and surrounding countryside for flowers. They visited local gardens, wild meadows, and even the roadside, gathering a diverse array of blooms. Roses from Mrs. Henderson's prized garden, daisies from the park where Elliot and Paige had shared their first magical picnic, even dandelions from the library lawn, each flower was chosen with purpose and care. Abigail's bistro became a floral workshop. Tables were covered with flowers, ribbons, and vases. The air was thick with the scent of blooms and the quiet concentration of friends working together to create something beautiful. On a quiet Sunday morning, when the library was closed to the public, Elliot put his plan into action. He arrived at dawn, arms laden with flowers and heart full of nervous excitement. Maggie, Jasper, and Abigail were already there, ready to help transform the library into a floral wonderland. As the sun rose, casting its golden light through the library windows, Elliot and his friends worked tirelessly. They placed vases on tables, draped garlands over bookshelves, and tucked small posies between books. Each arrangement was accompanied by one of Elliot's handwritten notes, carefully placed to guide Paige through their shared history. By mid-morning, the library had been transformed. Every corner held a new surprise, a fresh burst of color and fragrance. Elliot stood in the center, surveying their work with a mixture of pride and nervousness. This was more than just a grand gesture, it was a promise, a declaration of love spelled out in petals and heartfelt words. As the appointed time drew near, Elliot's friends wished him luck and quietly slipped away. He was left alone in the flower-filled library, his heart pounding with anticipation. Meanwhile, Paige had received a mysterious note that morning, asking her to come to the library. Curious and slightly puzzled, she made her way there, her mind racing with possibilities. As she approached the library, she noticed something unusual. The path leading to the entrance was lined with an assortment of flowers, not the perfectly uniform bouquets one might expect from a florist, but a charming mix of wildflowers, garden blooms, and even a few dandelions. Each step revealed a new variety, a rainbow of colors and textures that brought a smile to Paige's face. Intrigued, Paige unlocked the library doors and stepped inside. What she saw took her breath away. The entire library had been transformed into a floral wonderland. Every available surface was adorned with flowers, vases on tables, garlands draped over bookshelves, even small posies tucked between books. The air was filled with a symphony of fragrances, from the sweet scent of roses to the delicate perfume of lilies. But it wasn't just the flowers that caught Paige's attention. Attached to each arrangement was a small note card. As she moved closer to examine one, she recognized Elliot's handwriting. "Remember our first meeting? You thought my painting had come to life." In a way, it had, because the moment I saw you, my world became more vibrant than any artwork could capture. Tears pricked at Paige's eyes as she moved through the library, reading note after note. Each one recalled a special moment they had shared. Our first magic lesson in the park. You made dandelion seeds dance in the air. I fell in love with your laughter that day. The night we chased enchanted cupcakes around Beanstalk Bistro. Your joy in the face of chaos made me see magic in a whole new light. When you comforted me after a spell went wrong. Your strength and compassion showed me that true magic lies in the heart. As Paige reached the center of the library, she found Elliot waiting for her. He stood nervously, his hands clasped behind his back, surrounded by a sea of flowers. But what struck Paige most was the absence of any magical aura around him. This was Elliot, pure and simple, without any magical embellishments. "Elliot," Paige breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "What is all this?" Elliot stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "Paige," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I wanted to show you that my love for you isn't dependent on magic. Every flower you see here was picked by hand, every note written without a spell. Because you deserve effort, not just ease. You deserve sincerity, not spectacle." He gestured around the room. "Each of these flowers represents a moment we've shared, a piece of our story. Some are beautiful and perfect, like roses. Others are simple, like daisies. And yes, there are even a few weeds mixed in, because every relationship has its challenges. But together, they create something more beautiful than any magical illusion ever could." Paige felt tears rolling down her cheeks as Elliot continued. "I've realized that the most powerful magic in my life isn't in my spells or enchantments. It's in the way you smile when you're lost in a good book. It's in the sound of your laughter when we're being silly together. It's in the warmth of your hand in mine as we walk through town." Elliot took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Paige's. "I love you, Paige. Not because you've learned to accept magic, but because you've taught me to see the magic in everyday life. And if you'll have me, I promise to choose you over magic every day. To work at our relationship with the same dedication I've given to my spells. To create a life filled with wonder, both magical and mundane, together." For a moment, Paige was speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in Elliot's words and the beauty of his gesture. Then, with a sob that was half laughter, half cry, she threw her arms around him. "Oh, Elliot," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "This is the most magical thing you've ever done." Elliot held her close, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "So, is that a yes?" he asked softly. Paige pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes. 1,000 times yes. I love you, Elliot. Magic and all." As they sealed their promise with a kiss, something extraordinary happened. The flowers around them began to glow softly, their petals shimmering with a gentle, otherworldly light. But this time, it wasn't Elliot's magic causing the display. "Paige," Elliot gasped, looking around in wonder. Are you doing this? Paige shook her head, just as amazed. No, I don't think it's either of us. They both realized at the same moment what was happening. This was wild magic, the kind that exists in the world independent of any wizard's spells. It was responding to their love, to the pure joy and connection they shared. As they stood there, surrounded by gently glowing flowers, Paige and Elliot understood that they had discovered the truest magic of all, the magic of love, of choosing each other every day, of finding wonder in the simplest moments shared together. Overwhelmed by emotion, they spent the next few hours wandering through the library, reading each note, sharing memories, and adding new ones. They laughed over the recollection of their magical mishaps, shed a few tears over the challenges they'd overcome, and marveled at how far they'd come. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves curled up in Paige's favorite reading nook, surrounded by softly glowing flowers. Paige rested her head on Elliot's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace and rightness that she'd never experienced. They parted with whispered, "I love you, S," and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring a new chapter in their magical love story. As Elliot walked home, a trail of softly glowing flowers sprouted in his wake, a testament to the enduring magic of true love, blooming eternal in the heart of Stardust. Chapter 20, A New Chapter Begins. The morning sun streamed through the library windows, casting a warm glow over the rows of books and illuminating the remnants of Elliot's grand gesture. A few flowers still lingered here and there, their petals shimmering with a faint magical light. Paige stood in the center of it all, her fingers tracing the spine of a beloved book, her heart full of the events of the previous day. As she heard the library door open, Paige turned to see Elliot entering, his arms laden with 2 steaming cups of coffee from Beanstalk Bistro. His face lit up with a smile that mirrored her own, and Paige felt her heart skip a beat. It was a simple moment, mundane even, but to her, it felt magical. "Good morning," Elliot said softly, handing her a cup. "I thought you might need this. Big day ahead, putting everything back in order." Paige accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Thank you. Though I have to admit, I'm almost reluctant to change anything. It's all so beautiful." Elliot set his own cup down and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "Well, we can't keep the library as a flower shop forever. But maybe we can keep a little of the magic?" With a gentle wave of his hand, Elliot conjured a small vase filled with an assortment of flowers, a miniature version of his grand display. He placed it on Paige's desk, where it would be a constant reminder of their love and the magic they shared. Paige felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked at the small bouquet. It was perfect, a blend of the magical and the mundane, just like their relationship. She turned in Elliot's arms, meeting his gaze with a smile. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Just like you." Their lips met in a tender kiss, one that spoke of promises kept and adventures yet to come. As they parted, both felt the now familiar tingle of magic in the air. Books on nearby shelves rustled their pages in a joyful dance, and the flowers in the vase seemed to glow a little brighter. Laughing softly, Paige rested her forehead against Elliot's. "I think the library approves of us." "Well, it is where our story began," Elliot replied with a grin. "Speaking of which." He took Paige's hand and led her to a specific shelf, pulling out a familiar book, the very one they had bonded over during their first meeting. As he opened it, Paige gasped. The pages were alive with magic, illustrations moving and changing, telling not just the story written on the pages, but their story. "Elliot," Paige breathed, watching as a miniature version of herself and Elliot danced across the pages, surrounded by books and magical sparkles. "This is incredible. I thought we could add to it," Elliot explained, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Every adventure, every moment we share, captured in these pages. Our very own magical storybook." Paige felt her heart swell with love. It was such a perfect blend of her love for books and Elliot's magical creativity. "I love it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I love you." Their kiss this time was deeper, filled with passion and promise. When they finally parted, both were slightly breathless, their cheeks flushed with happiness. As they began the task of restoring the library to its usual order, with perhaps a few magical touches here and there, Paige and Elliot talked about their future. They made plans for magical date nights and quiet evenings at home. They discussed how to balance Elliot's magical experiments with Paige's need for order, finding compromises that would allow both of them to thrive. "You know," Paige said as she shelved a book on magical theory next to a romance novel, "I think I finally understand what you meant about magic being everywhere. It's not just in spells and enchantments. It's in moments like this, working together, building a life together." Elliot nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "And in the way you organize these shelves with such care, in the joy you take in helping people find the perfect book. That's its own kind of magic." As they worked, they reminisced about their journey together. They laughed about their early misadventures, the runaway magical bouquet in the enchanted garden, the chaotic cooking class that ended with sentient utensils, the time Paige accidentally turned Elliot's hair into a rainbow during a magic lesson. "Remember when you tried to surprise me with that miniature galaxy?" Elliot chuckled, levitating a stack of books back to their proper place. Paige groaned good-naturedly. "How could I forget? I nearly created a black hole in your living room. But you know what? I wouldn't change a thing about that night. It was the moment I realized that I loved the chaos you brought into my life just as much as the order." Elliot's eyes softened as he pulled her close. "And I realized that your steadiness, your ability to find beauty in the everyday, was exactly what I needed to ground my magic. We balance each other perfectly." As the day wore on, friends stopped by to help and offer congratulations. Maggie and Jasper arrived with lunch, and the four of them shared a picnic on the library floor, surrounded by books and laughter. "I can't believe you two finally got your act together," Maggie teased, biting into a sandwich. "We were about ready to lock you in a room together until you figured it out." Jasper nodded in agreement. "The whole town could see you were meant for each other. Even the magical community was rooting for you." Paige and Elliot exchanged a glance, their hands intertwining. "Sometimes," Paige said softly, "the most obvious magic is the hardest to see when you're in the middle of it." After lunch, Abigail from the bistro brought a cake decorated with edible flowers that changed flavors with each bite. As they all enjoyed the magical dessert, Abigail regaled them with stories of magical couples from Stardust past. "You two remind me of Gertrude and Harold," she said, her eyes twinkling with memories. "She was a no-nonsense schoolteacher, he was a whimsical wizard who could make stars dance. Everyone thought they were too different, but their love was the stuff of legends. They say that on clear nights, you can still see constellations spelling out their names." As the afternoon turned to evening, the library slowly transformed. It was still recognizably the orderly, welcoming space Paige had always maintained, but now it sparkled with touches of Elliot's magic. A few books now floated gently between shelves, offering themselves to undecided readers. The card catalog hummed softly, able to locate any book with a mere thought from the librarian. And in Paige's office, the magical vase of flowers sat proudly on her desk, a constant reminder of love's transformative power. By the time they were finished, the library had become a perfect blend of their two worlds, organized yet whimsical, familiar yet magical. It was a physical representation of their relationship, a space where order and chaos coexisted in beautiful harmony. As the last of their friends left, Paige and Elliot found themselves alone in the quiet library. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, giving everything a dreamy, ethereal quality. They stood in the center of the main room, arms around each other, taking in the fruits of their labor. "It's beautiful," Paige murmured, resting her head on Elliot's shoulder. "I never imagined the library could feel even more like home, but somehow, it does now." Elliot pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's because it's not just your space anymore. It's ours. A little bit of you, a little bit of me, and a whole lot of love." As if in response to his words, the magical storybook they had created earlier floated off its shelf and opened before them. Its pages glowed softly, showing scenes from their day, the tender morning kiss, the laughter-filled lunch with friends, the shared looks of love as they worked side by side. "Shall we add today's chapter?" Elliot asked, a mischievous glint in his eye. Paige nodded, and together, they began to recount the day's events. As they spoke, their words appeared on the pages in shimmering ink, accompanied by moving illustrations that captured not just the events, but the emotions behind them. When they finished, Paige read aloud the last lines that had appeared in the book. "And so, Paige and Elliot began their greatest adventure yet, a life together filled with love, laughter, and a perfect balance of order and chaos. They knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them hand in hand, their love a magic more powerful than any spell." As Paige's voice faded, the book gently closed itself and returned to its place on the shelf. In the quiet that followed, Paige and Elliot shared a look of deep understanding and love. "Ready to go home?" Elliot asked softly. Paige nodded, but then a thought struck her. "Wait," she said, a smile playing on her lips. "There's one more thing I want to do." She led Elliot to the children's section of the library, to the very spot where they had first met. With a wave of her hand, a gesture that felt both foreign and completely, their life together would be a grand adventure, filled with magical mishaps and mundane moments, quiet evenings, and spectacular enchantments. But through it all, they would have each other, their love a constant source of wonder and magic in a world that never ceased to amaze them. As they closed the book and shared one last kiss among the shelves, Paige and Elliot stepped into their future, a future where magic and mundanity blended seamlessly, united by the unbreakable bond of their love. And in the heart of Stardust, their story continued, a testament to the enduring power of love, laughter, and a little bit of magic. The stars twinkled brightly overhead as they made their way home, each lost in thoughts of the future they would build together. Paige, once so devoted to routine and order, found herself eager for the unpredictable joys that lay ahead. Elliot, who had once seen magic as a means to impress, now understood the true wonder of everyday miracles. As they reached Paige's apartment, soon to be their shared home, they paused on the threshold. This moment, simple as it was, felt monumental. It was the beginning of their life together, the start of a new chapter filled with endless possibilities. "Welcome home," Paige said softly, unlocking the door. Elliot's smile was radiant as he followed her inside. "Home," he repeated, the word filled with warmth and promise. "I like the sound of that." As they settled in for the night, making plans and dreaming of the future, neither Paige nor Elliot could imagine the adventures that awaited them. But they knew, with unshakable certainty, that whatever came their way, they would face it together, with love, laughter, and just the right touch of magic. And so, as the first page of their new life turned, Paige and Elliot drifted off to sleep, their hearts full of love and their dreams filled with the magic of possibilities. In the quiet of the night, a soft glow emanated from the magical storybook on their bedside table, as if it too was eager to see what the next chapter would bring. For in Stardust, where the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary blurred, Paige and Elliot's love story was just beginning, a tale of magic and mundanity, of order and chaos, of two hearts finding their perfect balance in each other's arms. The end.